Tonight we follow a war-worn sailor's decade-long voyage home, hunted by gods and tempted by the sea. The storytellers have long spoken of thee. Here is how they tell it. Before you settle in, take a moment to subscribe, but only if these stories genuinely bring you peace. And drop a comment telling me where in the world you are right now and what time it is there. These myths have travelled further than the Greeks ever imagined. Now find your quiet and let the story begin. Long before the wandering began, there was a small island. They say it was unremarkable in the way that beloved things often are, not grand like Crete with its labyrinthine palaces, not famous like Mycenae with its lion gates and golden walls. Ithaca sat quietly in the Ionian Sea, its hills terraced with olive groves, its harbours modest, its skies the same pale blue that has always hung over the Greek world at the edge of evening. The old accounts place this island at the centre of everything, not because of its size, but because of its king. His name, in those ancient tellings, was Odysseus, son of Laertes, grandson of the trickster Telemachus, who is said to have taught cunning to the world long before anyone thought to name it cunning. The blood of cleverness ran in Odysseus from before he could speak. So says the tradition. So say the poets who carried the tale across centuries. He was not the mightiest king in Greece. Agamemnon held that distinction, ruling from Mycenae with a treasury deep as a well and a voice that could silence runes. Achilles was the swiftest, the most terrible in battle, Ajax the most immovable. But Odysseus was the one with the mind that never quite stopped moving, that turned problems over the way a craftsman turns wood, looking for the grain, the place where the material would yield. The stories say he was well made for this island life. He knew his olive trees by name, or so it was said by those who tended the legend in later years. He knew the shepherds who worked the hills, and the fishermen who came back before dawn with their nets heavy and their eyes red from salt. He had a wife whose name the world would eventually learn to hold with great care, Penelope, daughter of Icarius. A woman of extraordinary patience, though at this early point in the story that patience had not yet been tested. And there was a son newly born, barely old enough to be called Telemachus, though that name too would one day carry its own weight. The trouble, as all ancient troubles do, came from far away. The cause of it, they say, was a golden apple and 3 goddesses, and a judgment made on a Trojan hillside by a shepherd prince named Paris. But the poets who shaped this telling often pause here to note that the cause of any great catastrophe is never truly one thing. It is always 100 small decisions, 100 moments where something might have turned otherwise but did not. What matters for this story is what followed. A Greek king's wife was taken, a fleet was assembled, and word came to Ithaca that Odysseus was needed. The old records tell of his reluctance. Some accounts suggest he did not wish to leave, that when the herald came to Ithaca bearing Agamemnon's summons, Odysseus made a choice that the storytellers have debated ever since. He feigned madness. The tale describes it carefully. He yoked an ox and a donkey together to plough the same furrow which any farmer would recognize as absurd. He sowed salt into the earth instead of grain. He wore the expression of a man whose thoughts had come untethered from the world. The assembled Greeks who had come to collect him watched this display with varying degrees of suspicion. It was a man named Palamedes who saw through it. He was clever himself, this Palamedes, and he had his own methods. He took the infant Telemachus from Penelope's arms and laid the child in the path of the plough. And Odysseus, without thinking, without being able to stop himself, turned the plough aside. The madness was exposed. A man does not protect his child if his mind has truly gone. He could not pretend past that instinct. And so Odysseus, caught between the performance and the love he bore, that small, helpless life in the furrow, straightened, became himself again. Said nothing that the records preserve, though the poets imagine many things he might have said in that moment of unmasking. He was bound then to the compact. The oath of Tyndareus, sworn by all the kings of Greece when they had competed for Helen's hand, required them to defend the man she chose, and whatever that marriage produced, Menelaus had chosen. Helen had been taken. Odysseus had sworn. He would go to Troy. Before he left, a prophecy was spoken. The tale does not always agree on who delivered it, whether it was an oracle, a seer, or something whispered through dream, but the content remains consistent across the tellings. If Odysseus went to Troy, his return to Ithaca would be long, more than long. It would be a wandering of years beyond counting. He would lose every companion. He would come home alone. The poets who carried this story down through the ages note that he went anyway. He kissed his wife and his infant son. He looked back at his olive-covered hills, at the modest harbour, at the sky above Ithaca that he had known since before memory. And he went to join the fleet that Agamemnon was assembling on the shores of Aulis, where the ships sat waiting and the wind was not yet right. That wait at Aulis had its own dark stories, its own sacrifices and consequences, but those belong to the tale of Agamemnon and his house, not to this telling. This telling concerns itself with one king, one island, one extraordinarily long road back. The 10 years at Troy are not the centre of this story, though they are its necessary foundation. The Greeks fought beneath those high walls for a decade, and Odysseus fought among them. He was valued there not for the volume of men he killed, though he killed many, but for his counsel, for the devices he conceived. It was Odysseus, so the tradition claims, who designed the final stratagem that ended the war. The great horse of wood, the soldiers hidden in its belly, the Trojans who pulled it inside their walls in the belief that they had won. But that ending is both an ending and a beginning. Troy fell, the fires rose, and the Greek fleet turned toward home, carrying with it men who had spent 10 years far from everything they loved. Among those men, on his 12 dark ships, was the king of Ithaca, his hair perhaps a little more grey now at the temples, his eyes carrying the particular quality that comes from having seen too much and slept too little for too long. The sea stretched open before him. Ithaca waited somewhere beyond the horizon. The prophecy, of course, had already told him what came next, but prophecies are curious things. Knowing a road will be long does not make it feel shorter when you are standing at its beginning. The first stars of that long return were beginning to show themselves over the water. The smoke of Troy had not yet left the air when the fleet divided. Some accounts describe the parting as orderly. Others say it was fractious, that Agamemnon and Menelaus argued on the shore while their men stood in groups and waited, watching the horizon with the particular exhaustion of soldiers who have spent a decade waiting for exactly this moment. The tale does not always preserve the details of that argument. What it preserves is the outcome. The Greek fleet did not go home as one thing. It scattered, each king pulling toward his own horizon, his own harbour, his own long-delayed life. Odysseus sailed with Agamemnon's portion at first. Then, so the tradition tells, he turned back. He went to join Menelaus. There were disagreements among the chieftains about which gods had been properly honoured in the sacking of the city, about what offerings had been made or neglected in the final hours of Troy's burning. These things mattered to the Greeks. They did not fight wars and then sail home carelessly. The gods were watching. The gods were always watching. But Odysseus was already behind before he had properly begun. His 12 ships moved northeast along the Thracian coast. The oars cut steadily. The men who rowed them were veterans now, dark-armed and quiet, men who had learned over 10 years to keep their thoughts small and their expectations smaller. They did not speak much of what waited for them at home. The storytellers note this detail with a certain gentleness. After long enough away, a man stops picturing his home clearly. He keeps a general warmth in his chest where the image used to be, and he moves toward it. And he hopes it has not changed past recognition. They came to Ismarus. The city of the Sirens stood on the Thracian shore. The records describe it as a coastal settlement of some prosperity, aligned in friendship with Troy. Odysseus and his men landed there. What followed is one of the first difficult passages in this long tale, and the storytellers approach it with a certain matter-of-fact steadiness. As if cataloguing something unfortunate but not unexpected, the fleet sacked the city. They took cattle, they took wine. They took what men take when war has made taking feel natural and coasts feel like extensions of the battlefield. The tradition does not linger here. It notes what happened without excess. Odysseus himself, so some accounts suggest, urged his men to move on quickly. He saw what they could not see yet. He was still thinking like a captain. But the men who had fought for 10 years felt the looseness that comes after long constraint. They lit fires on the beach. They opened the wine they had taken. They feasted through the night on the sand while the embers of Ismarus glowed behind them. It was not wisdom, but it was human. By morning the Cicones who had escaped rode back with allies from the interior. These were mounted men. Horsemen trained for exactly this kind of retribution. The storytellers describe the counterattack with quiet precision. From the landward side, the horsemen came in numbers that the Greeks had not anticipated. The fighting was brief and costly. For each ship, 6 men did not return to the oars. 6 men per vessel across 12 ships. The counting of that loss takes only a moment to state. The poets who carried this tale note that the numbers were precise in the old records, as if someone on those ships had kept count carefully, had made sure the dead were remembered, at least in their quantity, even when their individual names did not survive. 72 men by the telling's arithmetic, left on a Thracian beach that was not theirs, far from the olive-covered hills of Ithaca, far from the rocky shores of their own islands and valleys and harbours. Odysseus pulled the fleet back to sea. The tradition does not record what he said to the surviving men as they rowed away from Ismarus. It records only that they went, that the oars moved, that the coast of Thrace fell behind them, and ahead was open water, and the ships were lighter than they had been in the wrong way entirely. A storm came down from the north soon after. This too the old accounts preserve carefully. The ships were driven south and east for 2 days and 2 nights. The men baled water and held ropes and tried not to be swept from the decks. Odysseus had lost 72 men to the Cicones, and now he sat in the stern of his ship watching the sea try to take more. The water came over the sides in grey sheets. The mast bent. The sail was furled and useless. For 2 days the storm had its way with them. Then it passed. Storms do pass. The sea calmed gradually, not all at once, the way a troubled thing settles in degrees in small quietings. The clouds thinned. The colour of the water shifted from grey-black to grey-green. The men's hands relaxed slightly on the ropes. They were somewhere south of where they meant to be. The landmarks they knew were behind them. Ahead was water and the uncertain shape of coastlines that none of them recognized clearly. It is here that the poets tend to pause in their telling and observe something about the nature of this voyage. The war had been a known thing. Long and terrible and costly, but known. Troy had walls, and the Greeks had camped outside them, and the shape of each day had a certain dreadful predictability. There were allies and enemies and rules to the killing, or at least the customs of it. What lay ahead for Odysseus was none of those things. What lay ahead was water and strange shores and peoples who had never heard of Troy and did not care about the oaths that had sent 1,000 ships to a foreign coast. What lay ahead was the world as it existed beyond the edge of Greek understanding. Some of the accounts suggest that Odysseus knew this, that sitting in the stern after the storm, watching his surviving men tend to the ships, he understood that the war had been the easier part. The war had a name and a purpose and an ending. What he sailed into now had only the distant promise of Ithaca, which he had last seen as a man who still had all his companions. He would not come home that way. The prophecy had told him he had not forgotten. The ships gathered themselves. They moved south together, 12 vessels reduced in their crews but still floating, still pulling toward whatever coast would show itself next. It was the island of the Lotus Eaters that came into view, low and still on the horizon. The island did not announce itself with cliffs or noise. It lay flat against the water, as if it had settled there long ago and seen no reason to rise. The men saw it from a distance and said little. They were past the point of speculation. They rowed toward it because it was land, and land meant fresh water, and fresh water was what they needed. The accounts differ, as they often do, on what the shore looked like when the ships drew near. Some versions describe pale sand and low flowering vegetation. Others mention a stillness in the air that was unusual, a heaviness not unpleasant, like the quality of a room where someone has been sleeping. The old poets were attentive to such details. They understood that a place's character announced itself before any event occurred within it. Odysseus sent 3 men ashore to scout. This is the moment the tradition handles with particular care. 3 men. Not a large party, not a small one. 3 is a number that appears with some regularity in these older tales, as if it carried its own quiet significance. 3 men were sent to learn what kind of people lived on this island. 3 men were sent to find out whether it was safe. They walked inland. The records do not describe what they saw in detail. What they describe is what happened to them. The Lotus Eaters were not hostile. This is the first and perhaps most important thing the tale establishes about them. They did not raise arms. They did not threaten. They offered food. The fruit of the lotus plant, which grew there in abundance, soft-coloured and heavy with a smell that the accounts describe variously as sweet or faintly medicinal or simply unlike anything else. The Lotus Eaters offered it without ceremony. They were, by all accounts, a gentle people. They shared what they had. They did not ask questions. The 3 men ate. What followed was not dramatic. That too is something the storytellers take care to emphasize. There was no visible change in the men. They did not fall. They did not cry out. They sat down, perhaps, on the ground near where the Lotus Eaters lived, and they were quiet, and time passed around them in the way that time passes when a person has stopped caring about its direction. They forgot Ithaca, not all at once. The tale does not suggest a sudden erasure. It suggests something slower and more insidious. The image of home, the particular quality of light on a rocky harbour, the sound of a specific voice, the feeling of a stone threshold underfoot, these things grew faint, not painful, simply distant, and then farther, and then gone the way a lamp diminishes when you walk away from it down a long corridor. At some point you stop noticing the darkness because you have stopped thinking about the light. The men who had eaten had no wish to return to the ships. They had no wish to go anywhere. They were content, in the particular way of people who have been relieved of wanting. They sat among the Lotus Eaters, and they did not weep, and they did not speak of home, because home had become a word attached to nothing in their chests. Odysseus went after them. The tradition is clear on this point. He did not wait to see if they would come back. He went himself, and he found them, and he saw in their faces what the lotus had done. The accounts note that he understood it immediately. He had the kind of mind that recognized danger in its quieter forms. He had seen men broken by violence, and he had seen men broken by despair, but this was different. These men were not broken. They were simply absent. They were present in their bodies and absent in everything else. He had them carried back to the ships. This is the detail that the old accounts return to most consistently, and it is worth sitting with for a moment. The men were not marched back. They were carried. They did not resist with violence. They wept. The accounts described them weeping as they were lifted and taken toward the water, not from pain, but from something like grief. The grief of being pulled away from a place where grief no longer existed. They reached for the shore as they were brought away from it. They called out, though the accounts do not record what they called or to whom. Odysseus ordered them bound beneath the rowing benches. He did this. So the telling suggests, without cruelty and without apology. He did it because it was necessary. The men who had eaten the lotus would have slipped back over the side of the ships and swum for shore if they had not been secured. He knew this. He acted on what he knew. The accounts note something further about this moment. The men who had not eaten watched. They were still themselves. They still carried Ithaca somewhere in their chests, warm and distant and not yet dim. They watched their companions weeping beneath the benches, reaching toward an island that was already growing smaller behind the ships, and they understood in the way that sailors understand things. Through the body before the mind, what had almost happened to all of them. No one else went ashore. Odysseus gave the order to row, and the oars went into the water, and the island of the lotus eaters fell away behind them. The men who had eaten eventually grew quiet. The accounts differ on how long it took. Some say by the time the island was out of sight. Others say the effects lingered for days, that those men moved through their duties with a heaviness, a reluctance, like men newly woken who cannot quite locate themselves in the morning. The tradition does not say whether they fully recovered the sharpness of their longing for home. It only says they rowed. The sea ahead was open. The storytellers who preserved this passage often paused at its end to observe what it meant in the larger pattern of the voyage. Odysseus would face monsters. He would face storms sent by gods. He would face the indifference of the sea itself over years and years of drifting. But this, the lotus, this was the first of the encounters that threatened not the body but the purpose. A man could survive a storm with his desire for home intact. He could survive hunger and cold and grief if he still knew what he was rowing toward. The lotus offered an end to all of that, not death, not defeat, merely the cessation of wanting. A man could live quite comfortably on that island, warm and fed and content, and never once think of the olive trees on his hillside. The child he had left behind before the child could speak full sentences, the wife who sat each night knowing that he was somewhere and not knowing where. There is a version of this tale in which the lotus is presented as mercy rather than danger. The people who lived there were not cruel. The fruit was not poison. One could argue that forgetting a 10-year war and a voyage that was already killing men by the dozen was not the worst thing that could happen to a person. Odysseus did not see it that way. He bound his men to the benches, and he gave the order, and the ships moved. Ahead, on the uncertain water, other shores were waiting. Their names were not yet known to the men pulling at the oars. Their shapes were not yet visible, but they were there, in the direction the prow was pointing, settled and patient in the distance, like things that had always known these ships were coming. The shore they found next was not like the shore they had left. Where the land of the lotus-eaters had been low and yielding, pale-sanded and still, this new coast rose from the water in dark masses. Stone cliffs, dense forest pressing down toward the sea. The accounts describe it as a place that did not invite approach, a place that simply existed, indifferent to the ships that anchored in its waters. The island was uninhabited, or nearly so. Goats moved among the grasses on the hillsides, wild goats thick with wool, moving unhurried through the green. The men hunted them and ate well and slept on the beach, and in the darkness across a narrow strait of water they could see another shore, lower and closer, from which firelight occasionally showed. They could hear voices, though not words. The tradition names this place only in relation to what happened there. The island itself is unimportant. It is the cave across the water that the storytellers remember. Odysseus took 12 men with him. He left the rest. He had learned by then that not every landing required his full force, but this is one of the places where the scholars who preserved these accounts observe that his curiosity outpaced his caution. He brought a goatskin of dark wine, a wine of exceptional strength, a gift from a priest of Apollo at Ismarus, undiluted and powerful. He brought it the way a man brings something he cannot entirely explain, by instinct, by some half-formed sense that it would be needed. The cave was enormous. The accounts are consistent on this point. It was not merely large. It was built to a different scale entirely. Pens of lambs and kids lined the walls. Great wheels of cheese sat drying on racks. Bowls of whey stood in rows. Everything was orderly, everything was massive, and everything made clear to any observant person that the one who lived here was not a man. His men wanted to take the cheese and go. This, too, the tradition records, and it records it without mockery, because they were not wrong to want it. They were sailors. They had already buried companions in the earth of strangers. They had watched men weep for a shore where weeping no longer existed. They knew what was prudent. Odysseus stayed. He told them he wanted to see the owner of the place. He wanted to see what gifts might be offered. He said this, the way a man says something he knows is not quite honest, with a slight heaviness in the words, a knowledge that the true reason goes deeper than he is willing to speak aloud. The accounts do not speculate on what drew him forward into that cave. They simply record that he stayed, and that his men stayed with him, and that they lit a fire and waited. Polyphemus came home at evening. The storytellers describe his arrival carefully, because it matters to understand what these men were looking at. He was a Cyclops, one of the sons of Poseidon, born of the god who ruled the seas these men had crossed. He was vast. He moved through the mouth of the cave the way a cliff face moves, slowly, absolutely. He carried a load of firewood on his shoulder and threw it down with a sound like stone falling on stone. He drove his flock inside. He set a boulder across the entrance of the cave that 20 wagons could not have shifted. Then he lit his fire, and in the light of it he saw the men. What followed is told differently in different places. Some accounts linger on the details. Others move quickly through them, the way a speaker moves quickly through the part of a story that does not need embellishment. The Cyclops asked who they were and where they had come from. Odysseus spoke carefully. He invoked Zeus and the sacred customs of hospitality, the xenia, the guest right that the gods themselves were said to enforce. He spoke of Troy and of the long voyage, and of the tradition that a host owed protection to a traveller. Polyphemus answered that the Cyclopes did not concern themselves with Zeus, that they were stronger than the gods and did not require their approval. He asked where Odysseus had left his ship. Odysseus lied. He said the ship was wrecked. He gave no location. The Cyclops reached for 2 of the men. The accounts do not dwell here, and this telling will not either. What matters for the larger shape of the story is this: Odysseus could not act that first night. The boulder blocked the cave. He could kill the Cyclops, but a dead Cyclops would still be an immovable stone, and they would starve in the dark beside the body. He lay awake and thought. This is what the tradition tells us. He lay awake and thought, and by morning he had the beginning of a plan. He found a stake of olive wood, green and heavy, lying on the cave floor. He hardened its tip in the embers while Polyphemus was away with his flock. He hid it beneath the dung along the cave wall. When Polyphemus returned that evening, Odysseus offered him the wine, the dark wine from Ismarus, undiluted. Odysseus offered it 3 times in a great bowl, and Polyphemus drank. The Cyclops was pleased. He asked Odysseus his name. He said he would give a gift in return for such excellent wine. Odysseus told him his name was Nobody. This is the moment the old accounts mark as the pivot of the encounter. Not the blinding itself, not the escape, but this, the name. Nobody. Autis, in the old Greek, Odysseus, whose name meant something close to trouble or pain depending on how the scholars passed it, who had given his name freely and foolishly before, now hid himself entirely inside a word that meant nothing. A man named Nobody could act without consequence. a man named Nobody could not be found. Polyphemus said that his gift would be to eat nobody last. He found this amusing. He lay down and slept, and the sound of his sleep filled the cave like a second presence. The stake was in the embers. The men drove it home. The Cyclops screamed. His cry brought the other Cyclopes to the cave entrance, calling through the stone. They asked what was wrong, who was hurting him. Polyphemus cried out that nobody was hurting him, nobody was killing him. And the other Cyclopes, hearing this, walked away. If nobody was hurting him, then the gods must be involved, and the gods were not their concern. The plan was nearly complete. Odysseus lashed his men beneath the great rams. 3 rams per man, the middle one carrying a sailor pressed against the wool. When Polyphemus moved the boulder at morning to let his flock out, feeling across their backs to check that no man rode above, the men slipped past beneath, hidden below the bellies of the animals. Odysseus went last, clinging to the wool of the finest ram. The great leader of the flock, and Polyphemus, as he passed this animal, spoke to it. He spoke softly, wondering aloud why the ram moved last today when it always led, wondering if it grieved as he himself grieved. The accounts preserve this moment with unusual care, a monster addressing his beloved animal in darkness, not knowing that the man who had blinded him hung beneath it, listening. They reached the ships. They rowed. And here the tradition turns, because Odysseus, already at sea, already clear, called back across the water. He gave his real name. He shouted it across the distance between his ship and that darkened shore. He told Polyphemus who had done this. He told him it was Odysseus, son of Laertes of Ithaca. His men begged him to stop. The accounts are vivid on this point. They reached for him, grabbed at his cloak, pleaded. They understood what he was doing, and they knew it was wrong, and they could not stop him. Polyphemus hurled a piece of cliff toward the sound of the voice, and very nearly ended the voyage there. Then the Cyclops prayed. He lifted his hands toward the sea, toward his father Poseidon, and he asked that Odysseus of Ithaca never reach home. Or if home was fated to him, that he arrive late, alone, on a foreign ship, after all his companions were gone, to find nothing but grief waiting. The sea received this prayer. Poseidon, god of that sea, heard his son's voice rising from the island. The accounts do not describe what the god felt. They only record that from this point forward, the water between Odysseus and Ithaca was no longer simply water. It had become something shaped by divine intention, slow and patient and resistant, the way a current resists a swimmer who has not yet understood how strong it is. The ships pulled away. Behind them, the Cyclops moved along his shore, hands forward, finding nothing. The fleet made for open water. 12 ships had entered the Cyclops' island. 12 ships departed. The men did not look back. The accounts say very little about what passed between them in those first hours on the water, and perhaps that silence itself is the record. Some things do not require narration. They require only time, and the steady rhythm of oars, and the gradual widening of distance between a ship and a shore where something terrible happened. Ahead of them lay the island of Aeolus. The old accounts describe this island with a careful precision that suggests it occupied a specific place in the cosmological understanding of the ancient world. It floated. That is what the tradition tells us. It was a floating island, ringed entirely by walls of bronze, rising from the water like something that had not yet decided where to belong. Aeolus lived there, the keeper of the winds, appointed by the gods to hold the great currents of air in his custody. He was not a god himself, the accounts are clear on this, but he had been given a god's work, the management of what moves invisibly through the world. Aeolus received Odysseus with hospitality. He fed the men. He listened for a full month, the tradition says, to Odysseus speaking of Troy. He found in this visitor something worth attending to, a man who carried the whole shape of the war in his memory and could lay it out in careful sequence. When Odysseus prepared to leave, Aeolus made a gift. He took the hides of a great ox, 9 years old according to some versions of the telling, and he sealed inside them every adverse wind, every current that blows contrary to a homeward course. He bound the bag with a cord of silver, drawn so tight that not a breath could slip through the stitching. This left free only the west wind, the gentle Zephyrus, which would carry the fleet from the bronze-walled island toward Ithaca without opposition. Odysseus took the bag aboard his own ship. He stowed it in the hold beneath the deck planks. He told no one what it contained. This is the part of the tradition that has drawn reflection from later scholars, and rightly so. Odysseus, who had just escaped a cave through the careful distribution of knowledge, who had taught himself in that darkness how much a man's identity could protect or destroy him, now carried a secret too large for one ship's hold. The bag of Aeolus was more than a gift. It was responsibility in its most literal form, the physical shape of everything that could go wrong, compressed into leather and bound with silver cord. For 9 days and 9 nights the ships sailed. The west wind pushed them steadily. The crew rowed when the wind slackened. Odysseus, the accounts tell us, held the tiller himself. He did not sleep, he watched the course. He trusted nothing to chance, not after what had come before, and this vigilance, sustained for 9 days across open water, is not a small thing. It is the kind of effort that eventually makes a man's hands loosen. On the 10th day, Ithaca appeared on the horizon. The accounts are careful here. Ithaca was visible. The men could see the smoke from shore fires. They could see, some versions add, the people moving along the island's edge. They were close enough to smell land, the pine resin and salt grass and turned earth that marks a coastline inhabited by the familiar. They had been at sea for 10 years of war, and then the months since Troy's burning. Ithaca was there, in front of them, real. Odysseus slept. He had held the tiller for 9 nights, and when home appeared on the horizon, his body decided that the danger was finished. He lay down on the deck of his ship. He closed his eyes. His men gathered around the bag in the hold. They had watched it for 9 days. They had spoken quietly among themselves about it, the way men speak when they believe they are not being overheard. What had Aeolus given their captain that he kept below the deck and spoke of to no one? Gold, some thought. Silver, said others. Gifts from a king to a king, the kind a common sailor never sees, carried home to Ithaca, while the men who had fought the same war and lost the same years received nothing. They opened the bag. Every wind that had been sealed inside it rushed out at once. The accounts use different words to describe what happened next, but the effect is consistent across all versions. The ships were taken. The sea rose. The west wind was simply gone, replaced by everything that had been imprisoned. The fleet, which had been moving toward Ithaca, was carried backward, away, out to open sea. The smoke from the shore fires disappeared behind them. Ithaca sank below the horizon. Odysseus woke to the sound of his ship in chaos. He understood immediately. The accounts do not record his words in this moment. They record only that he considered throwing himself into the sea, and that he did not. Something held him to the deck. Whether it was calculation or grief is not a question. The tradition answers with certainty. They were carried back to the floating island, back to the walls of bronze and the halls of Aeolus. Odysseus went ashore and asked for help again. He asked to be reprovisioned, for the winds to be resealed, for a second chance at the crossing. Aeolus refused him. The accounts give Aeolus a brief speech in which he says that a man so hated by the gods is not a man he will assist a second time. Whatever goodwill had existed between them was dissolved by what had happened. Aeolus sent them away. The fleet departed the bronze-walled island for the second time. This time without assistance. This time into open water that offered no particular direction and no promise at the far end of it. 7 days they rowed, hard rowing, without favourable wind. The men were exhausted by the time a harbour appeared ahead of them, a great natural harbour with high cliffs on either side, nearly enclosed, only a narrow mouth open to the sea. This was Telepylos, the harbour of the Laestrygonians. 11 of the 12 ships entered the harbour and anchored inside it. Odysseus, the accounts note, tied his own ship outside at the harbour mouth, at a distance from the others. The tradition offers no clear explanation for this. Perhaps instinct, perhaps the memory of another harbour, another island, another choice made too quickly. His ship stayed at the entrance, while the 11 others settled inside the cliffs. The Laestrygonians were a race of giants. That is what the tradition tells us. Their queen, when 3 of Odysseus's men found her drawing water from a spring, was not a woman in any scale they recognized. She directed them to the palace of their king, Antiphates, and the accounts say the men walked that path without yet understanding what they were walking toward. What followed was swift. The old accounts do not linger on it, and this telling will follow their restraint. Antiphates took one of the 3 men. The other 2 ran. They ran back to the harbour, shouting. And behind them the Laestrygonians gathered on the cliff tops that walled the harbour on every side. They threw boulders, not in the manner of Polyphemus, who had hurled cliff sections into open sea with nothing to aim at. These boulders fell into an enclosed harbour where 11 ships sat anchored and unable to manoeuvre. The cliffs gave the Laestrygonians every advantage. The ships could not back oar fast enough. They could not separate from each other in the narrow space. One by one the accounts record them going under, and then the Laestrygonians waded into the water with their spears. And the men in the water were not men for long. Odysseus cut the rope of his own ship with his sword. He did not wait for the harbour. He did not go in after the others. The accounts do not apologize for this, and neither does this telling. He cut the rope, and he shouted at his oarsmen, and they drove their oars into the sea and pulled. The single ship cleared the harbour mouth. It entered open water. Behind them, smoke rose from 11 harboured ships already sinking. It rose into the morning sky above the cliffs of Telepylos, grey and slow. 12 ships had left the Cyclops' island. 1 ship now continued westward across the sea. The men who rowed it did not speak. They rowed, and the smoke above the cliffs grew smaller, and the accounts say only that they were glad to be alive, and that gladness and grief were on that morning the same weight. They came to Aea on a day when the sea offered neither resistance nor welcome. The island rose from the water with a low, wooded coastline, pine trees dark against the pale sky, and the accounts describe the men beaching the ship in silence. They had nothing left to say to one another. The oars were drawn in. The hull scraped sand. No one celebrated landfall. They sat on the beach for 2 days, the tradition tells us, too exhausted and too diminished to do anything more. On the 3rd day, Odysseus climbed a promontory and looked inland. He saw smoke rising from somewhere deep among the trees. Thin smoke, rising straight, the mark of a hearth. Something lived there. He returned to the men and divided them into 2 groups. One group would go inland to find the source of the smoke. The other would remain with the ship. The tradition records that no one wanted to go. The men drew lots. Eurylochus, a man the accounts name as second in command, a man married to a sister of Odysseus, led the group that the lots selected. 22 men followed him into the trees. The house they found was not what any of them expected. It stood in a clearing built of smooth stone, surrounded by wolves and lions that moved without menace. The accounts are careful here. These animals did not attack. They did not threaten. They circled the men with something like attention, something close to recognition, the way a dog moves toward a returning figure. Eurylochus understood this as a warning. He held back. His men did not. From inside the house came music, and a voice, and the smell of something woven from herbs and fire. The men moved toward it. The voice invited them in. All of them entered except Eurylochus, who remained outside watching through the trees. waiting because some part of him recognized the wolves for what they had been before they were wolves. The woman inside was Circe. That is how the tradition names her. A goddess, some accounts say. A witch, say others. The daughter of Helios, the sun, and the Oceanid Perse. She had been on this island before Odysseus had been born, weaving at her loom. Tending her craft, living according to a set of rules that were not the rules of the world the men had come from, she fed them. She gave them food mixed with honey and wine and barley, and into the food she introduced something the accounts call a pharmacon, a word that means both cure and poison, depending on the hand that holds it. The men ate. She touched each one with a long wand, and the men became pigs. The tradition does not elaborate on what this felt like. The accounts are quiet on the interior of the transformation. What the records preserve is simpler. The men were taken to her steeds and given acorns, and the world they had known was reduced. Eurylochus ran back to the ship. He arrived unable to speak clearly. He told Odysseus what he had seen, as much of it as he could form into words. He would not return. He said this plainly, and the tradition does not mark him as a coward for it. He had seen the wolves. He had understood what the wolves meant. Odysseus went alone. He walked the path his men had taken, through the pine trees, past the silent stone wall where the animals moved in slow circles. He walked toward the house of Circe alone, and the accounts note that this is one of the moments in the long story where Odysseus is most purely himself. Not speaking, not planning aloud, moving toward the thing that had taken his men because they were his men, and that was the only calculation that mattered. Hermes met him on the path. The tradition says Hermes appeared as a young man, a figure with the look of someone at the edge of adulthood, and he addressed Odysseus by name. He said that Odysseus was walking toward the house of Circe, and that he should know what awaited him there. He said the pharmacon would not work on Odysseus if Odysseus carried a particular plant, a plant the gods call moly. The root of it is black, the tradition says, and the flower white. The gods can pull it from the earth. For mortals it is difficult. Hermes gave him the plant. He gave him instructions. He told Odysseus what to do when the wand touched him, and then he was gone, departed down the wooded path, leaving Odysseus with a flower and a sequence of directions. What happened inside the house has been told in many versions, and the versions agree on the shape of it. Circe fed him. She touched him with the wand. Nothing happened. Odysseus drew his sword and moved against her, and Circe did what the accounts say she did. When a man could not be transformed, she recognized him. She asked how he had resisted her art. She said that only one man had been prophesied to come to her island carrying an antidote. She spoke his name. She said the name was known to her before he arrived. The tradition records a long pause in the narrative at this point. After the pause, Circe restored his men. She brought them from the steeds and touched them again, and the accounts describe the men returning to themselves slowly, younger than they had been. Or cleaner, the transformation undone so completely that something of the damage before it was also undone. The men wept when they saw Odysseus. He does not weep in the accounts. He holds them and lets them weep, and this is treated by the tradition as its own form of feeling. Eurylochus and the men who had stayed at the ship were summoned. They came reluctantly. Some of them did not want to go near the house at all, but they came, and they ate at Circe's table. And the woman who had turned men into animals served them food that was only food, and wine that was only wine. A year passed on a year. The accounts treat this year with brevity. They name it. They do not fill it hour by hour. The men ate well and grew strong again. The sea was still beyond the trees. No storm came. No reason arose to leave quickly. Circe was a host, and Odysseus was in her house. And the tradition understands the year as a rest earned after losses that had not yet stopped accumulating. Near the end of the year, it was the men who came to Odysseus. The accounts preserve this detail carefully, not Circe. not a divine messenger, the men. They reminded him of Ithaca. They reminded him of home. They said the word aloud around the table, and the word had the effect it always has in this tradition. It reminded Odysseus that he had somewhere to be. He went to Circe and told her they wished to leave. She did not refuse him. The accounts agree on this. But she told him that before he could find his way home, he would need to do something that no living man had done before. He would need to go to the realm of the dead. He would need to speak with the shade of Tiresias, the blind prophet of Thebes, who alone among the dead retained his full understanding. Tiresias would tell him what the path home required. There was one more thing the accounts preserve from this chapter of the story, small and easily overlooked. A man named Elpenor, one of the youngest of the crew, climbed to the roof of Circe's house on the night before their departure. The accounts say he had been drinking. He fell. He did not fall gently. He died at the base of the wall without anyone nearby to witness it. The crew departed before realizing he was missing. He had not been buried. The shade of Elpenor would be the first figure Odysseus encountered in the realm of the dead, waiting at the entrance with only one request, that someone return to bury him, so that the ground could hold what the sea had not taken. The ship left Aeir with Circe's instructions and the wind she sent to fill its sail. The island receded behind them. The sky ahead was the colour of ash. The path that led to the place the tradition calls the entrance to the Underworld was not a path through stone or underground tunnel, not in most of the accounts that have come down to us. It was a voyage to the far edge of the known world, to a shore where the sun does not reach in the usual way, where the light arrives sideways and pale and seems to belong to no particular hour. Circe had named this shore. She had named the rivers, and the order of the rituals, and the way the pit should be dug, and what should be poured into it. Odysseus followed her instructions the way a man follows directions when the consequences of error are not recoverable. They rowed in silence mostly. The wind Circe had sent helped them for a time, and then the wind quieted, and the oars took over, and the men rowed without speaking because there was nothing to say that was useful. They were heading towards something that had no precedent in their experience. The shore came into view slowly, as shores do, resolving from a pale smear on the horizon into something with texture and detail. Dark grasses grew close to the water. The trees beyond were not trees they recognized. They were tall and narrow, and their branches held no colour, no green, only a greyness that was not quite silver. The ship touched the sand, and they made it fast. Odysseus dug the pit the way Circe had described. It was not large, a pit of a certain depth and a certain width, and into it he poured libations in the order she had named, honey and milk first, then sweet wine, then water, and over all of it a scattering of white barley. He spoke the words that the tradition says must be spoken to the dead. He promised them offerings when he returned to Ithaca. He promised a barren cow and a black sheep for Tiresias alone, better than the rest. Then he cut the throats of the sacrificial animals over the pit, and the dark blood ran down into the earth. The shades came. They always come in this account as a crowd, not one by one, but pressing toward the blood from all directions, and the tradition describes Odysseus standing beside the pit with his sword drawn, holding them back, because the blood had to be reserved for Tiresias first. There were young men among the shades, and old ones, and women who had died in grief, and warriors with wounds still visible on them. They pressed close, but they did not speak. Without the blood, they could not speak. The first to arrive who could be recognized was not Tiresias. It was Elpenor. The accounts are careful about this. Elpenor had not yet been buried. The crew had left before they knew he was gone, and his body still lay at the base of Circe's wall on the island of Aeaea. His shade had arrived at the entrance to the Underworld before his body had been given to the ground, and so he stood at the edge of things, neither fully placed among the dead nor returned to the living world. He spoke his name. He spoke the manner of his death, falling from a high roof in the dark, his neck broken on the stone below. He did not speak with anger. The accounts note this specifically. He spoke with the particular quiet of someone making only one request, the simplest possible request, the one that required nothing from the living world except the act of remembering to return and complete it. He asked to be buried. He asked for his oar to be planted in the earth above him, so that men passing might know the marker. He asked that his name be spoken over the grave. Odysseus told him it would be done. The tradition treats this exchange without excessive weight. It is brief. The promise is made, and Elpenor recedes, and the crowd of shades shifts and presses again. And then Tiresias came forward, the shade of the blind prophet of Thebes, carrying the golden staff that distinguished him even in death. Odysseus held back the other shades and let Tiresias approach the pit. The prophet drank from the blood. Then he raised his face and spoke. The prophecy that Tiresias delivered concerns two things above all others. The first is the cattle on the island of Thrinacia, the cattle that belong to Helios the sun god, animals of impossible beauty that must not be touched or harmed or reduced in number. If the crew can restrain themselves, the tradition says, Odysseus may yet reach Ithaca, though the path will not be short. If they cannot, he will arrive home alone on a foreign ship, after great suffering, to find his house occupied by men who have made themselves at home in his halls. The second thing Tiresias speaks of is what comes after Ithaca. A further wandering, a final appeasement of Poseidon, whose wrath does not dissolve simply because a man reaches his own shore. But this part of the prophecy belongs to a different chapter of the story. What matters here, at the edge of the pit, is what Odysseus hears about the journey still ahead of him and the weight of what it will cost. Tiresias stepped back. The other shades pressed forward. Among them came a woman. The accounts say Odysseus recognized her before she reached the blood, recognized the way she moved, the shape of her. And that recognition arrived in him the way recognition sometimes does, as something that tightens the chest before the mind has named it. It was Anticlea, his mother. She had been alive when he sailed for Troy. He had not known she was dead. He had not been home to know it. She drank from the blood and looked at him, and she knew him immediately. She asked him why he was in the realm of the dead while still living, and he told her what he could. He told her he was trying to find his way home. She told him what was happening in Ithaca in his absence. She said Penelope still waited, still kept faith, still sat in the halls of the house he had built, holding the household together by the sheer force of her refusal to accept that he was not coming back. Odysseus tried 3 times to embrace her shade. Each time his arms passed through her and closed on nothing. The tradition does not offer this as a moment of despair. It offers it as a fact about shades, about the nature of the dead, about what the living cannot hold, no matter how much they want to. Anticlea herself explains it calmly. She tells him this is how it is with all who die. The shade does not have substance to be held. He should not grieve it. She should not grieve it. She said she was glad he had come. The pale grasses stirred faintly along the shore where the crew waited by the ship, and the dark blood in the pit slowly stilled, and the shades pressed and murmured at the edge of the light. And Odysseus stood among them, his sword in his hand, his mother's face already beginning to fade back into the general crowd of the dead. After a time, the other shades came forward. They say many heroes appeared in that dim place, pressing toward the pit one after another, each drinking from what remained, and each offering what they carried. The accounts name them. Agamemnon, king of kings at Troy, his voice still bearing the specific flatness of a man who had died, betrayed, and could not move past that fact. He told Odysseus to be careful of women. He said this without particular bitterness, the way a man repeats a lesson that cost him everything. Achilles came too, brilliant and swift even in death, and he told Odysseus that he would rather be a poor man's servant on earth than king over all the dead. This the tradition records as the truest thing Achilles ever said. Ajax did not speak. He stood at a distance from the pit and turned his face away. Some quarrel over Achilles' armour, given to Odysseus after Troy and not to him, still held him in its grip even here. The tradition says Odysseus would have spoken to him. Ajax refused and walked back into the dark, and that was the end of it. Odysseus saw many others. He saw great women whose names the tradition preserves. He saw figures whose stories had no further bearing on his own. He stood among them until the sheer press and number of the dead began to move in him, something that had no name but felt like the edge of fear, not terror of the dead themselves, but a subtler unease. The sense that the boundary he was standing inside was not meant to hold indefinitely, that he had already been here longer than the living were meant to remain. He went back to the ship. The crew was waiting. They pushed off from that pale shore, and the oars moved, and the ship put distance between them and the place where sunlight arrived sideways, and did not commit to any hour. The tradition is quiet on how long the sail took before they reached Aea again. There was a ceremony to complete. Elpenor had asked, and Odysseus had promised, and the promise held the way. Promises made at the edge of the underworld tend to hold, with a particular gravity, as though the dead themselves had witnessed the speaking of it and kept record. They gave Elpenor fire and burial. They piled up a mound of earth and planted his oar in it, and spoke his name over the grave. The accounts are brief on this. It was a small ceremony. Elpenor had been one man among many, not a hero of note, not a great figure of the war. He had fallen from a high roof in darkness. His oar stood in the earth on the island of Aea, and men who passed later would see it and know that someone lay beneath. Circe came to them at dawn on Aea, bringing bread and wine and meat. She sat with Odysseus, and he told her what he had seen. She told him what lay ahead, not vaguely but precisely, the way she always spoke, with the calm authority of someone who understood the structure of the journey, even if she was not taking it herself. She told him about the Sirens. The accounts say they lay next in the path of any ship sailing those waters. 2 of them, stationed on an island, their voices carrying across open water with impossible clarity and beauty, and the content of what they sang was not mere melody. The tradition is specific on this point. The Sirens sang knowledge. They sang the entire account of Troy, every engagement, every name, every night spent on that bloodied plain. They claimed to know all things that came to pass upon the broad earth, and perhaps they did, and perhaps the song was true, every word of it, and that was precisely the danger. Any man who heard them, and was not restrained, would go toward them. He would beach his ship on their island. He would not leave. The island, the accounts say carefully, was thick with bones. Circe told Odysseus what he must do. She was matter-of-fact about it, as though discussing the management of a navigational problem rather than the management of human longing. She told him to fill his crew's ears with beeswax so that none of them could hear the song at all. She told him that if he himself wished to listen, he must be bound to the mast before the island came within hearing. He must instruct his men in advance to row harder if he commanded them to stop or release him, and to add more ropes, and not to release him under any persuasion until the sound had passed entirely. She spoke this with the directness of someone who understood desire without being subject to it in the same way the living were. The ships set out. The tradition describes the waters that day as very still. The sea lay flat and pale under a sky that offered no particular wind. The crew rowed in measured rhythm, their oars entering and leaving the water with a steadiness that the accounts suggest was itself a kind of discipline. Each stroke a deliberate act of forward motion in the absence of what would drive a ship more easily. Odysseus had the beeswax prepared. He sealed each man's ears himself. He did it methodically, moving from one to the next, pressing the wax in with his thumbs, checking it, moving on. The accounts say nothing about what expression he wore while he did this, only that it was done. Then he stood at the mast and told them to bind him. They used ropes. Multiple ropes wound around him and the mast, tight enough that he could not move his arms or shoulders. He had told them what to do if he called out. They knew. They bound him anyway and took their positions at the oars. And rowed. The island came into view as a low shape in the water. The song reached him. The tradition does not describe the sirens' voices in terms of any instrument or any tone the ear knows from ordinary life. It says only that what Odysseus heard was beautiful in a manner that seemed to contain everything he had ever wanted to know. The whole story of the war arrived in him again as sound, not as memory but as clarity. Every moment he had been present for and every moment he had not, laid out in perfect order. He heard his own name in the song. He heard the names of the dead. He strained at the ropes. He called out to his men to stop rowing, to let him go, to come to him. They could not hear him. They rowed. The island remained at a distance. The ship moved past it in a long, slow arc, the oars steady. The men bent over their work with the particular concentration of people who cannot hear what is happening around them, and so are left only with the immediate task. And Odysseus was bound to the mast at the centre of his own ship, hearing everything, going nowhere, the music of all that he had survived and all that he had lost moving through him like water through stone. Then the island was behind them. The song thinned. It became one layer of sound, then a presence without particulars, then silence. He called out to his men. This time he gave a signal they had agreed on, a signal that meant the danger was past. They unwound the ropes. He stood free on the deck. The beeswax was removed from the men's ears, and they rubbed their jaws and shook their heads and did not ask what they had missed. Or perhaps they asked, and the accounts do not record it. What the tradition preserves is only that the island was behind them now, already indistinct in the flat morning sea, and that the crew bent to the oars again, and that ahead of them the water waited. Unmarked and continuous, the next thing neither seen nor named yet, arriving as it always does on a voyage like this one, without announcement. The song was gone. The knowledge it had promised was gone with it. Odysseus stood at the prow and did not speak. The sea was very still around him. The oars measured out the quiet in long, even strokes. Ahead of them the water changed. The stillness held, but something beneath it shifted. The sea that had lain flat and pale through the Siren passage began to carry a different quality in the middle distance, a faint turbulence, a restlessness that the oarsmen felt before they saw its source. The men had their ears cleared now, the beeswax gone, and so they heard it first as sound, a low continuous rushing. Not the sound of weather, which arrives from one direction and passes. This sound came from ahead, and it did not pass. Circe had spoken of this too. She had described the strait with the same even voice she used for everything. Two passages lay before them, she said. On one side rose a cliff so high that no eagle had ever reached its summit. In the cliff face, halfway up, a cave, and in the cave, Scylla. The accounts offer different descriptions of Scylla, and the tradition acknowledges they cannot all be reconciled. What they agree on is this: 6 heads, 6 long necks, each neck capable of reaching down to the water's surface from the cave's mouth, each head containing 3 rows of teeth. She was not, Circe had said with precision, a creature that could be reasoned with, or outrun, or defeated. She was a fixed feature of the strait, as the rocks were fixed, as the cliff was fixed. She had been there before any ship had come through, and she would be there after. Circe's counsel on this point was plain. Accept that 6 men would be taken. Do not linger trying to fight her. Keep the ship moving. On the other side of the narrow channel lay Charybdis. There was no creature there to name, only the sea itself, drawn down into a vortex 3 times each day and released again. When Charybdis pulled the water under, she pulled it to the sea floor, and the exposed rocks around her gaped black and streaming. When she released it, the sea boiled upward and the spray reached the cliffs. A ship that entered that motion would not come through it. Circe said this without equivocation. Odysseus had not told his crew about Scylla. This is a detail the tradition preserves with some care without judgment either way. He had made the calculation. Circe had made the same calculation and offered it to him, tell them, and they might drop their oars and refuse to row, or crowd toward the far side away from the cliff, which would bring them toward Charybdis instead. The accounts suggest Odysseus considered this. He told them about Charybdis. He described the whirlpool on the left side of the channel and told them to row hard and stay right. He did not mention the cliff. He did not mention the cave. He put on his armor. He took his 2 spears. He stood at the bow and watched the cliff ahead. The sound grew as they entered the strait. Charybdis was to their left. They could hear her before they could properly see her. A roaring that came up from the water rather than down from the sky. The men at the oars pulled hard, their rhythm more urgent now, the steady measured stroke of the open sea replaced by something shorter and more forceful. The ship leaned slightly with each pull. Water ran along the hull in thin, fast lines. Ahead, the passage narrowed between the cliff and the churning water on their left side. And the current that moved through that narrow space was not the same current that had moved beneath them in the open sea. It had direction. It had will. It pushed the ship forward and sideways at once. And the helmsman worked to hold the course. Odysseus was looking at the cliff. He was looking at the cave. He could not see anything in the cave from where he stood. The darkness of it was complete from that distance. He held both spears and watched the darkness. The tradition records what happened next with a particular directness. 6 men were taken. The accounts name them: Perimedes, Polites, and 4 others whose names the older texts preserve and the later summaries sometimes drop. They were taken from different positions along the ship, not all at once. Scylla was efficient, the records suggest, in the way that something ancient and purposeful is efficient. The heads came down, the necks extending from the cave mouth with a speed the watching men could not track, and then the men were gone from the deck. They called out, the accounts say. Odysseus heard them call his name. He could not reach them. He was at the bow with 2 spears, and there was nothing above him but the descending necks, and then the ascending necks, and then the cliff face, silent. The speed of it meant that by the time any man on the ship understood what was happening, the men were already above the water, already being carried upward toward the cave. The tradition notes that Odysseus watched them go. It notes that he did not look away. It says nothing further about what he felt, but it preserves the detail that he watched. The ship came through the narrowest part of the passage. The sound of Charybdis was very loud on their left. The men at the oars did not look left. They rowed. The current that had been pushing them forward and sideways now straightened as they cleared the worst of the strait, and the helmsman felt the ship come back under his hands the way a rope goes taut. Ahead, the passage widened. The cliffs on both sides drew back. The water beyond the strait opened into something larger, calmer, still lit with the flat morning light that had persisted since they left the Siren waters. Scylla's cave was behind them. The men who had been taken were not behind them. The deck had 7 fewer people than it had carried into the strait. The accounts note the remaining crew sat at their oars without speaking for some time. No one had a word for what had just happened that fit inside ordinary speech. The loss was too fast and too complete for grief to organize itself cleanly. There was only the fact of it, and the water ahead, and the continuing necessity of rowing. Odysseus sheathed his spears. He moved back from the bow. He did not speak to the men yet. There was nothing to say that the moment could hold. This is not a judgment the tradition renders, only an observation. Some losses are too immediate for language, and the sea was still moving beneath them. And they were still on it. Land appeared ahead. A long, low island, green above its shoreline, rising to a broad interior plain. The accounts agree on what the island was, even when they disagree on the details of everything else. Thrinacia, the island of the sun. the place where Helios pastured his cattle, the herds that belonged to no one else and could be claimed by no one, the cattle that Tiresias had named in the Underworld. Standing at the pit of blood, warning Odysseus in the flat and careful voice of prophecy, "Do not touch the cattle. Whatever else happens, do not touch the cattle." The island was visible now as a distinct shape in the water. Its hills caught the morning light and held it, green and golden above the pale sea. From this distance it looked restful. From this distance the interior plain that the accounts describe as the grazing ground of the immortal herds could not be seen at all. There were only the hills and the shore and the light on the water between the ship and the land. Eurylochus spoke first. He said that the men were tired. He said they had come through the strait and lost companions, and the rowers needed to rest. He said the island ahead was land, and that there was no shame in making shore before dark, when an open sea in a tired ship was a harder thing to navigate. Odysseus stood at the stern and looked at the island. He thought of Tiresias. He thought of the warning, precise and unambiguous, given in the underworld with the dead pressing at the edges of the firelight. He looked at the faces of his crew, the men who had made it through the strait, the men who had sat silent over their oars while the sound of Charybdis faded behind them. He told them they could land. He told them they could rest and eat and take water from the island's streams. He told them the cattle they would see on the plain were sacred and untouchable, and that they must swear this before the ship came ashore. Every man. The accounts record that they swore. The ship came in toward Thrinacia's shore, and the green hills rose above the hull as they drew close, and the evening light, which had been building slowly behind them all day, reached the water ahead and lay there in long gold lines, and the island received them. The accounts note that Thrinacia was quiet in a way Odysseus had not expected. The shore was level and pale, the stones smooth, and the water behind the ship had already settled into its evening stillness. No waves of any size reached the beach. The island offered itself without drama, which was its own kind of persuasion. They made camp above the tide line. There was fresh water from a stream that came down through the hills, cold and clear, and the men drank deeply and said very little. The oath they had sworn on the water was still present among them. It did not need to be repeated. It lay over the camp the way the dusk itself lay over the island, softly, without force, covering everything. Odysseus prayed that night. The accounts record this. He prayed to the gods who had not yet finished with him, and the night received his words without answer. As nights do. The winds changed before morning. This is the detail the tradition returns to most carefully when it speaks of what happened on Thrinacia, not the act itself, but what made it possible. A wind from the south, the accounts say, one that sealed the harbour and made departure impossible. It settled over the island with the particular patience of something that has no reason to hurry. The sea beyond the harbour ran grey and rough. The ship sat drawn up on the shore, its hull out of the water, useless for as long as the wind held. They waited a day, then several days. Then a period the accounts measure differently across different tellings. Some say a month. Some say longer. What they agree on is the hunger. Their provisions ran out. They had brought what remained from the strait. It was not much. They fished from the shore, and some days the fishing was sufficient, and some days it was not. They gathered what grew along the hillsides. The island was not generous with food. It offered grass, and the cold stream, and the wind that would not release them, and the sight of the plain where the cattle of Helios moved in their slow, radiant procession, fat and unhurried and untouchable. The accounts describe the cattle of Helios with a particular care. Their hides were of exceptional whiteness, broad-backed and sleek, moving through the grass of the interior plain with the unhurried ease of creatures that have never known fear or scarcity. The daughters of Helios, Phaethusa and Lampetia, tended them. The accounts name these two guardians and note their presence on the island without elaborating on what they looked like or how close they came to the camp of Odysseus. They were there. they watched, the cattle grazed. The men grew thinner. Odysseus, the accounts say, went apart to pray during those weeks. He went to higher ground above the camp and prayed for release. The tradition preserves this without irony. He was a man who had spoken with the dead and navigated the worst water in the world, and now he sat on a hillside above a harbour he could not leave and asked the gods for wind. The gods did not send wind. What came back to him each time was only the sound of the sea below, running grey and uncooperative. He slept one afternoon in this place above the camp. The accounts record this too. He slept, and while he slept, Eurylochus spoke to the men. What Eurylochus said is preserved in several versions, and they agree closely enough. He said they were going to die on Thrinacia if nothing changed. He said starvation was itself a death. He said the cattle on the plain were visible from where they stood and numerous, and that to die of hunger in sight of food was its own form of offence against the gods, who did not expect men to welcome death passively when life was available. He said that if they made proper sacrifices, if they honoured Helios with the parts of the animals the god was owed, and if they promised to build him a temple upon returning to Ithaca, there was a chance the god would understand necessity when he saw it. He said a great many things. The men were very hungry. They took the cattle before Odysseus came down from the hill. The accounts record what they did with a careful deliberateness. They cut branches of oak from the trees above the shore. They had no barley to use as sacred offering, so they used leaves instead. They performed the rites as correctly as their circumstances allowed. They roasted the meat. They made the portions that belonged to the gods. They observed the forms. The accounts also record what Lampetia did. She went to her father, Helios, the accounts say, came before Zeus in a state of outrage that the telling captures with precision. He described what had been done to his cattle, the sacred herds that had accompanied him across the sky since the beginning of what could be called time, the herds that no mortal hand was to touch. He said that if he received no justice for this, he would take his light down into the underworld and let the upper world manage without it. This is not a threat the tradition takes lightly. The light of Helios was not a convenience. It was the structure around which mortal life organized itself. Zeus heard him. Zeus gave his word. The winds changed. That is how the tradition marks the moment. Simply that. The wind that had sealed the harbour for all those weeks released. The sea beyond the harbour flattened. The sky was clear. The men launched the ship and set the sail and left Thrinacia behind them. The island diminished behind the hull. The plain was no longer visible, only the hills growing smaller, and then only the line of the shore, and then nothing. Zeus waited until they were clear of any sight of land. The cloud came from a direction the accounts describe, but do not specify more precisely than that, a dark mass building fast in the west. The sea, which had been calm for the first time in weeks, began to move beneath the hull with a new intention. The wind struck. It struck the sail first, and the accounts describe the sound of it, a crack and a tearing, and then the mast came down. The mast fell and struck the helmsman. He went into the water. The thunderbolt came after. Zeus sent it into the ship, and the accounts are plain about what it did. The ship broke apart. Not slowly, not in stages that allowed for decisions or preparations, but all at once, in the way of things that are ended rather than damaged. The men were in the water. All of them. The sea around the wreck was full of timber, and the men among the timber, and then only the timber. Odysseus survived by holding to the keel. The accounts specify the keel. He stripped the mast lashing and bound the keel and the mast together and lay across them while the sea moved beneath him. He was the only one who did this. He was the only one still on the surface when the timber settled into its slow dispersal across the water. He lay there through the night. The tradition does not attempt to describe his thoughts at this point. It simply notes his position. a man on a length of timber, the sea around him empty. By morning the current had begun to draw him back. He recognized the sound before he recognized what it meant. Then he recognized what it meant. Charybdis was beneath him, drawing the water down, and the keel-mast assembly he was clinging to was going down with it. He reached up and caught the branch of a fig tree that overhung the rock above the vortex, and he held on while the timber disappeared below him into the churning dark. He waited in that fig tree. The tradition says, until the sea released what it had taken. The accounts note that the mast and keel came back up. They came up in the boiling water that Charybdis expelled, and Odysseus dropped back down onto them and paddled with his hands away from that place. He had no oars. He had no sail. He had his hands, and the timber, and the open sea ahead of him, and Ithaca somewhere beyond the horizon in a direction he could still remember. He paddled. The open sea received him without ceremony. The accounts that preserve this portion of the tale are careful to say very little about what passed through his mind during those first hours of paddling. This is not an oversight. The tradition understands that certain silences belong to the man who lived them, and that to fill such silences with invented thought would be to diminish what they actually contained. He paddled. The timber moved. The sea was wide. What the tradition does say is that he came, in time, to an island. The island was called Ogygia. The accounts describe it in a way that is consistent across most of the versions. Remote, set at the center of the sea, wooded with alder and poplar and fragrant cypress. Inhabited by birds, crossed by 4 springs that ran in different directions from a single meadow at its heart. The accounts describe it as beautiful. They describe it as very quiet. A nymph named Calypso lived there alone. Her name, in the older forms of the language, carries the sense of concealment. The concealer. The one who covers over. The tradition notes this without extensive comment, allowing the name to suggest what it suggests. She found him on the shore. This is how the accounts render it. She found him, and she cared for him, and she kept him. The tradition is plain about the length of time he remained on Ogygia. 7 years. The accounts do not soften this number or make it approximate. 7 years. Whatever Ithaca had been before, whatever Penelope had looked like in the particular light of an Ithacan morning, whatever sounds the harbour made when the wind came down from the hills of his own island, all of this he carried in him for 7 years, while the sea between him and those things remained uncrossed. Calypso offered him immortality. The accounts record this carefully because it is the central fact of Ogygia, the fact around which everything else on that island organizes itself. She offered him immortality. Not as a rhetorical gesture, not as a promise she could not fulfill. She was a daughter of Atlas, the accounts say, and the offer was real. He could remain on Ogygia. He could remain beside her. He would not age. He would not die. The sea would go on moving beyond the shore, and he would go on watching it. And Ithaca would be a memory that grew no more painful because it grew no older, and eventually perhaps even the memory would soften into something bearable. He refused. The tradition records his refusal with the same quietness with which it records everything about Ogygia. He refused, and then he was still on the island, because Calypso did not release him. He refused the offer of immortality, and remained a mortal man on an island in the middle of the sea, and each day the sun rose and crossed overhead. And each evening it descended, and the years accumulated around him the way water accumulates in still places. He sat on the shore. This is the image the accounts preserve with the most care. Odysseus sitting on the shore of Ogygia, facing the sea, facing the direction he understood to be the direction of home. The tradition says he sat there every day. It says he wept. It says the weeping was not weakness, but orientation, that it was the way a man who has refused immortality maintains his connection to the thing that makes him mortal, which is the desire to return to the life he came from. Calypso, the accounts say, watched him. There is a version of this story that is interested primarily in her grief, and the telling acknowledges this version without dismissing it. She was a goddess, or near enough to one. She had lived alone on this beautiful island for longer than any mortal accounting could contain. She had offered everything she had to give, and what she had to give was considerable, and it had not been enough. She watched him sit on her shore and weep for a woman who was aging in a stone hall in Ithaca, a woman made of mortal time and mortal grief, and she understood that this was what she could not compete with. Not youth, not beauty, not even love exactly. The specific weight of a specific life accumulated over specific years in a specific place. She kept him anyway. The tradition does not excuse this. It notes it, 7 years. The accounts mark the duration and pass on. Then Hermes came. He came at Zeus's instruction. The accounts are clear about this, and they are equally clear about what prompted Zeus to act. Athena spoke for Odysseus before the assembled gods. She described his situation plainly: the island, the years, the nymph who held him, the sea he could not cross. She said that he remembered Ithaca. She said that he had not stopped remembering. The accounts indicate that this mattered, that it was not a small thing to have remembered for so long and so faithfully. Zeus sent Hermes. The messenger god came to Ogygia. As the accounts say, he travelled all difficult distances swiftly, and without apparent effort, touching down on the shore with the ease of something that belongs to the air. He found Calypso in her cave, the great cave the accounts describe with care, the fire burning, the smell of cedar and citrus wood, the loom where she wove with a golden shuttle, the vine thick at the entrance bearing clusters of ripe fruit. He delivered the message. Zeus commanded that Odysseus be released. Calypso's response is one of the moments the tradition preserves with particular attention. She did not pretend to be glad. She said what she thought of it plainly. She said that the gods were quick to object when a goddess loved a mortal, and she named others who had done so before her, and she named what the gods had done to punish those arrangements. She said she had saved this man from the sea. She said she had cared for him and offered him a life that no mortal could offer. She said that releasing him was likely to send him to further suffering, because the sea between Ogygia and Ithaca was long, and Poseidon had not forgiven him. Then she said she would release him. She went to find Odysseus where the tradition always places him, on the shore, facing the sea. She told him he could go. The accounts record that he was suspicious, that he asked her to swear an oath before he believed it fully, because he was a man who had learned the cost of believing easily. She swore the oath on the waters of the Styx, as gods swear when they mean to be believed. He was quiet for a time after that. Then there was the matter of building a raft. The tradition gives this its proper place in the telling. Calypso showed him where the trees were. She gave him tools, an axe, an adze. She did not build it for him. He built it himself over 4 days, felling the timber and shaping it and fitting it together, stepping back to look at what he had made, and then continuing. On the 5th day she gave him clothing and provisions for the crossing. She gave him wine and water and bread. She gave him a favourable wind. The accounts note that she herself raised this wind, that it was hers to give, and that she gave it. He sailed on the 17th day after Hermes' arrival. The accounts count the days exactly. He left Ogygia the way he had arrived at it, alone, with water on every side. But now he was moving. The raft was low and the sea was large, but it was moving and ahead of it. Somewhere past the line where the sky came down to meet the water was the direction he had sat facing for 7 years. Calypso stood at the shore until the raft was gone. The accounts note this without elaboration. She stood there. The raft diminished. The sea was the same sea in every direction, holding nothing now where it had held him. The wind she had given him carried the raft steadily forward through the first nights of crossing, and Odysseus steered by the stars, keeping the Pleiades on one side and the late-setting Boetes on the other. And the bear, which the accounts say Calypso had told him to keep always on his left hand, turned slowly overhead in the dark. He did not sleep. For 17 days the raft moved steadily, and Odysseus kept his watch over it, and the sea offered nothing to disturb him. Then Poseidon looked down from the mountains of the Solymi. The accounts are careful here. They note that the god of the sea had been away, attending a feast among the Ethiopians, and that his absence was what had allowed the plan to unfold. Hermes had come to Ogygia. Calypso had agreed. The raft had been built and provisioned and set upon the water, all while Poseidon sat at the far edge of the world eating food offered in his honour. This is the tradition's way of explaining what would otherwise seem an oversight. The gods do not miss things. They are elsewhere. But Poseidon returned, and as he turned back toward Olympus, he looked out across the sea, and there was the raft. There was Odysseus on it. The accounts record what Poseidon felt when he saw this. Not surprise, but something that functioned like displeasure at a task left unfinished. He had not forgotten. He had been feasted and honoured at the world's edge, but he had not forgotten the cave of the Cyclops, or the cry Polyphemus had sent up to the sea, or what had been done in darkness with a sharpened stake and a burning brand. The god gathered the clouds. He called on the winds from all four quarters. The accounts say the sea rose quickly. This is the word they use, quickly. The waves came from east and south and north and west at once, and they were not moderate. They drove against each other and against the raft, and Odysseus felt the timbers shift under his feet in a way that wood should not shift when it has been properly joined and tested. He had been at sea long enough to know what that movement meant. He grasped the mast. The accounts give him a moment of private reckoning here, and they preserve it because it is the kind of moment that reveals a man accurately. He thought of those who had died well, on dry land, after long lives, surrounded by the people who loved them. He thought that he would have taken that. He thought that dying here, in the dark water, without having seen Ithaca, was a poor ending for a story that had already cost so much. Then the wave came. It came from above, the accounts say, not from the side. A great breaking wall of water that struck the raft and scattered the logs. Odysseus went into the sea still holding the mast, and the mast went down with him, and he came up without it. The provisions Calypso had given him were gone, the wine, the water, the bread. All of it gone in the time it takes a wave to fall. He clung to one of the beams that had not yet separated from the others, and the sea moved around him in every direction. And there was no land anywhere. This is the chapter where the story turns. Not toward Ithaca directly, not yet. The road back does not run in a straight line in this tradition. It bends and doubles and requires the traveller to pass through one more unasked-for ordeal before the final bearing can be set. But the turn is real. What follows from this moment is different from what came before it. Before, there was the raft. Before, there was a plan, a direction, the stars, and a favourable wind and 17 days of steady progress. Now there is only the open sea and one man in it, and the question of whether he can survive long enough to arrive. It was Ino who came to him. The accounts give her name carefully. Ino, sometimes called Leucothea, the white goddess, who had once been mortal and had been changed, transformed into a sea nymph through suffering of her own, through stories the tradition tells separately and does not need to repeat here. She rose from the water beside the broken raft. She had the look, the accounts say, of a diving bird settling on the swell. And she spoke to him plainly. She told him to abandon the raft. She told him to strip off the clothing Calypso had given him, and to take instead the veil she held out to him, her own veil, and to wrap it around his chest. She said it would keep him afloat. She said that, when he reached land, he was to cast it back into the sea without looking behind him. Then she went back beneath the water. The accounts record that Odysseus held the veil and did not immediately do what she had told him. He looked at what remained of the raft, and he thought about it, because he was Odysseus, and thinking about things before committing to them was how he had survived as long as he had. There were still beams beneath him. The raft was destroyed, but the pieces had not yet dispersed. He wondered whether it was wiser to hold to the wreckage or to trust the veil of a sea nymph who had emerged from nowhere and vanished back into the same. Poseidon decided the question for him. Another wave. The accounts describe it as larger than the previous one. It struck what remained of the raft and scattered the beams definitively, one lob from another, nothing now to cling to. Odysseus let the wreckage go. He wrapped Ino's veil around his chest, and he swam. 2 days. The tradition gives the duration without softening it. 2 days and 2 nights in the open sea, without the raft, without provisions, without anything except the veil and his own will to continue. The sea did not calm entirely for him. Poseidon had other matters to attend to eventually, and the god departed, but the swells did not quiet quickly, and Odysseus swam through water that did not invite him forward. He swam anyway. On the 3rd morning he saw land. The accounts describe what he saw from the water: high cliffs and surf breaking against rocks at their base, and no easy place to come ashore. The sea was still running hard, and the rocks at the cliff face were sharp and close together, and the wave swell lifted and dropped him without regard for his intentions. He reached for the rock face and caught a handhold, and the wave pulled back and scraped him along the stone, and he let go before the pulling took him into a crevice from which he could not return. He swam along the cliff face, searching. The accounts say Athena guided him here, though she did not appear. She opened a river mouth in the cliff, a place where the current ran outward into the sea rather than inward onto rock. Odysseus felt the change in the water and turned toward it. He prayed to the river. The tradition preserves this prayer because it is unusual, a man praying not to a god of Olympus, but to a river at the edge of a coast he did not yet know, asking it to receive him. The river heard. The current eased. He came ashore on his hands and knees. He lay on the bank of the river where it met the sea, and the accounts note that he was breathing, and that for a moment this was sufficient. He was scraped and exhausted, and had been 2 days in the water, and was now on ground that would hold still beneath him, and he lay there in the sedge on the river bank, and the veil he unwound from his chest and cast back into the current as Ino had instructed, and the current took it out toward the deeper water where it disappeared. He needed shelter. He found an olive grove set back from the beach, 2 trees grown close together with a canopy of overlapping branches, dense enough to turn rain. He gathered fallen leaves and pulled them over himself until only his face was uncovered. The accounts say the leaves were deep and dry and plentiful. They say he was warm quickly. They say he slept. He slept as a man sleeps who has spent 2 days in the sea and is now, for the first time in a very long time, on solid ground. In the morning Nausicaa came down to the river with her handmaids to wash the household linens, and they spread the cloth on the stones to dry, and they played a game with a ball in the shallows while they waited, and the ball went wide of its mark and struck the water with enough sound to wake the man sleeping under the olive leaves at the edge of the grove. Odysseus lay still for a moment beneath the olive leaves listening. The sound of the water and the voices resolving slowly from the shapeless noise of waking into something he could pass and understand. Women, young from the lightness of the laughter. Near the river, which meant near the beach, which meant he was still lying where he had fallen, and the grove still held him in its shadow, and the morning had come fully while he slept. He lay there and he assembled himself. This is one of the things the tradition wants us to understand about Odysseus. That he was not a man who acted before he had thought, even when the urgency was real. He lay under the olive leaves and he took stock of what he had and what he needed. He was alive. He was on land. He was scraped from the cliff face and salt, whitened from 2 days in the sea, and wearing the remnants of clothing that Calypso had given him when he departed Ogygia, which had not improved during the passage. He had nothing else. no provisions, no weapons, no ship. No companions, no way of knowing where he was or how far he still was from Ithaca, but there were women's voices at the river. He broke a branch from the nearest olive tree as he rose from the leaves. Not as a weapon, but as a covering, a leafy branch held at his side in the way that a man holds something between himself and an uncertain reception. He thought about how he would appear, stepping out of a grove of trees on an unfamiliar coast, scraped and salt-dried and ragged, and he thought about what a frightened girl might do when she saw him, and he thought about what he needed from her, which was not fear but information, and, if the gods were merciful, a direction toward a city. He stepped out of the shade of the grove and into the open morning. The light came down on him fully after the cool shadow of the overlapping branches, and he stood for a moment at the grove's edge and looked toward the river. The linen had been spread on the flat stones along the bank to dry, white cloth heavy with water laid out in careful rows. The handmaids were in the shallows, and they were laughing, and they had not yet seen him. But the girl standing apart from the others, the one with the bearing that the accounts describe as already carrying something of a queen's composure, even in the informality of the morning. She was watching the ball drift downstream toward the sea, and when the ball went past the last flat stone, it entered the current, and the current began to carry it away, and she looked up from the ball, and she saw Odysseus standing at the edge of the olive grove. The handmaids scattered. The accounts say this plainly, without unkindness. They were young, and they had not expected this, and what they saw was ragged and large, and had come from the shadow of trees without warning. And they ran to the other side of the river without stopping to think about what they were running from. The linen remained on the stones. The ball continued downstream. The girl stood. Her name was Nausicaa, daughter of Alcinous, king of the Phaeacians. And the accounts treat her with a particular care, a kind of attention that the tradition reserves for figures who appear briefly but leave an impression that lasts beyond their pages. She was a princess doing laundry by a river on a quiet morning, and she had just seen a man emerge from a grove of olive trees in a condition that strongly suggested the sea had recently tried to kill him, and she did not run. Odysseus spoke from where he stood, some distance away, his voice careful and unhurried. He told her she was like a goddess. The accounts preserve this compliment without irony, because it was not merely a compliment, but an observation about rarity, the rarity of someone who stood still when the situation offered running as an option. He told her that he had been 20 days at sea and 2 days in the water, and that he had come ashore that morning with nothing, and that he was asking, if she was willing to hear such a request, for some small covering for his body and some direction toward whatever city lay nearest to this shore. He asked the way, he asked the river, directly, without excessive performance. Nausicaa answered him. She told him he was on the island of the Phaeacians, and that her father was the king, and that she would take him to the city. She told the handmaids, who had returned to the far bank at the sound of her voice and were watching from a careful distance, to come back and to bring water and food and to find him clothing. She told them this with the same composure she had shown in standing still. The natural authority of someone who has grown up in a house where the way a person carries themselves is considered as important as anything else they carry. The handmaids obeyed. They brought a cloak and a tunic from the folded linen set aside for the household, and olive oil in a flask for washing, and food and wine. Odysseus took himself to a private place beside the river, and washed the salt from his skin and the blood from the scrapes on his hands and chest. And he dressed in the clothing they had given him, and when he came back to the bank, the accounts say that Athena had arranged the light around him with the particular attention she gave to her favourites. The way a craftsman adjusts the angle of a lamp to show a finished piece at its best, and Nausicaa looked at him and said to her handmaids that she wished the gods would send a man like this to be her husband. The accounts record this without embarrassment. It is simply what she said, and she said it quietly. And Odysseus heard her, but the tradition does not record what he thought about it. He was thinking about Ithaca. The journey to the city was arranged with Phaeacian practicality. Nausicaa would ride ahead on the wagon that had carried the laundry down from the palace that morning, because it would not be proper for her to arrive at her father's house with a stranger walking beside her. And people would talk, and she was of an age when people talked easily. Odysseus was to follow behind at a distance, and he was to enter the city after the wagon had gone ahead. And he was to make his way to the palace and find the queen. She told him this with the specific care of someone explaining a route they know well to someone who knows nothing. She said to find Queen Arete before speaking to her father. She said this as though it were the most important piece of information she had to give him, and the account suggests she was right. He followed the wagon into the city as she had instructed, moving through streets that had the quiet beauty of a place that has been prosperous long enough to become casual about it. The Phaeacians were sailors, famously. The greatest navigators in the world, the people to whom the gods had given ships that sailed without pilots, and harbours that never iced over, and a particular relationship with the sea that made them useful to the divine plan in ways they were only sometimes aware of. Their city had the look of a place that understood the sea without being afraid of it, wide harbours and good stone and ships drawn up on the beach with the relaxed competence of a civilization that has been doing this for a very long time. Odysseus moved through the streets in the cloak Nausicaa had given him, and Athena, still not appearing, wrapped him in a veil of invisibility for the passage through the city, so that he arrived at the palace without being stopped or questioned, which was what he needed. The palace of Alcinous was one of the things the accounts dwell on with genuine pleasure. Its walls were bronze, and the frieze at the top was blue enamel, and the doors were gold, and the doorposts were silver, and there were golden dogs on either side of the entrance, immortal and ageless, made by Hephaestus to guard the hall, and inside the hall there were golden youths holding torches that lit the banqueting room through the long evenings. The accounts describe all of this not to impress, but to establish what kind of place the Phaeacians inhabited, which was a place at the edge of the world where the gods and mortals still moved close to one another, where the divine craft that produced immortal watchdogs could also produce ships that found their way without pilots, where the boundary between the ordinary world and something finer was thin enough to be crossed in a single step. Odysseus found Arete. He crossed the hall and came to her where she sat beside the hearth, and he knelt and took her hands. And the invisibility Athena had wrapped around him dissolved at the moment of contact, the way that divine concealment sometimes dissolves when the moment for it has passed, and the Phaeacians around the hall looked up from their cups and saw a stranger at their queen's feet and fell silent. He asked for passage home. He said it plainly. He had suffered long, and he was far from his own island, and he was asking the queen and her husband and the people of this city for help in returning to where he needed to be. Then he went and sat in the ashes of the hearth in the supplicant's position, and waited. Alcinous came and raised him up and gave him a seat, and called for more wine, and told his people that a guest sat among them, and that the gods sent guests to those who honoured guests, and a feast was called for on the following day, a feast at which everything would be decided. He was fed that night in the great hall, and the eating was good, and the wine was warm, and the fire in the hearth sent its heat across the benches in long waves, and Odysseus sat among the Phaeacians, and felt the tension that had been in him since Ogygia. Since the raft, since the 2 days in the sea, beginning at last to ease, the way tension eases when safety becomes real enough to be believed. He slept in the palace that night in a bed with linens and a carved wooden frame, and a window that let in the sound of the harbour, the soft movement of ships at anchor, familiar and settling. He heard the water, and it was different from the water that had carried him here, different in character entirely, contained and purposeful and nearby, the sound of ships that would go out in the morning and come back in the evening because the Phaeacians knew the sea and the sea. For them was not the enemy it had been for him. The feast came the following day. The hall filled with the Phaeacian nobility, the lords and princes and their families, men with the look of those who have spent their lives on the water and have made peace with it. The tables were carried in, and the food was set out, and the wine was poured, and Alcinous called in the blind bard. His name was Demodocus. The accounts give his name with the same care they give Nausicaa's. He was old and he was blind, and he walked into the hall with the particular unhurried confidence of a man who has been doing this long enough to know where the benches are without needing to see them. He was seated near the centre of the hall, near the hearth, and a page brought him his lyre, and he set it in his lap and did not immediately play. He sat for a moment. There is something the accounts ask us to notice about Demodocus that is easy to pass over if you are reading quickly. He was blind, and the tradition understood blindness in a particular way when it appeared in those who sang, not as loss but as exchange. What was taken in one form returned in another, the outer eye closed so that something else could open. Homer himself is said to have been blind. Tiresias, who saw the future, saw nothing in the present. Demodocus saw nothing in the hall around him but what he knew of the world of heroes. The wars and the longships and the men who had fought and suffered at Troy and after was not second-hand knowledge. It was given to him the way such knowledge is given to those the Muses favour, directly, completely, with no requirement that it be witnessed to be possessed. He began to play. The song he chose was Troy. He sang of Odysseus and Achilles quarrelling at a feast. A specific quarrel that the accounts locate in the early years of the war, before the final assault, the two greatest of the Greek heroes disagreeing about strategy or precedence, or one of the many things great men disagree about when they are confined together too long with too much at stake. He sang it with the particular precision that the tradition associates with Demodocus, the sense that he was not composing as he sang, but remembering that the events he described had weight and texture and specificity because he had been given them whole and was only now returning them to the ear. The hall listened. Odysseus reached up and drew the edge of his purple cloak over his face, covering his eyes. Alcinous noticed. The accounts say he noticed because he was a king who paid attention to guests, which is the Phaeacian virtue that the tradition returns to repeatedly, the understanding that how you receive a stranger tells you something about the quality of your civilization. He watched Odysseus cover his face, and he understood that the song had caused this, and he understood that a man does not cover his face when a song about Troy moves him, unless he has some connection to Troy that is not merely the connection of a listener to an interesting story. He called for the song to stop. He called for games instead, athletic contests in the Phaeacian style, and the young men of the court went out to the grounds and ran and threw and wrestled in the afternoon sun. And Odysseus watched from the edge and was asked if he would compete. And there was a moment of provocation from a young Phaeacian who said something unfortunate about the appearance of the stranger, suggesting he was perhaps a merchant rather than an athlete. And Odysseus picked up the discus and threw it considerably farther than anyone else had thrown it that afternoon. The accounts tell this without labouring the point. He was Odysseus. He was scraped and salt-dried, and had been 2 days in the open sea, and however many days on a raft before that, and he was still, when provoked, what he had always been. The evening came back around to the hall and the feast, and Demodocus was called in again and given his lyre, and this time Odysseus asked him for a specific song. He asked for the song of the wooden horse. He asked for it, and he asked it as a test, partly the way he had tested things all his life, asking for the story he was part of, to see what the telling of it contained, to see how much the blind bard knew. Demodocus sang the horse. He sang it with the same precision he brought to everything, the horse built and hauled to the gates of Troy and the Greeks hidden inside it, and the Trojans debating what to do with it in the firelight, while the Greek fleet waited beyond the horizon. And then the horse opened from the inside in the darkness, and Odysseus came out of it first, and went through the streets of Troy in the night. Odysseus covered his face again. He wept. The accounts describe his weeping with the specific comparison the tradition uses for things that need to be named rather than minimized. Like a woman weeping over her husband, fallen in battle before the gates of his own city, falling on his body while the enemies close in around her. the armies of two nations converging on one woman's grief. He wept like that. The accounts do not apologize for the comparison or explain it at length. They simply say that this is how he wept, and that Alcinous noticed again, and that this time the king did not call for games. He looked at the man beside him in the great hall of the Phaeacians, the man wrapped in the cloak Nausicaa had provided from the household linens, sitting at the feast table with tears running from beneath the cloak's edge, and he asked, in the direct way of a king who has been patient long enough and has earned his answer, "Who are you?" He said, "We have feasted you, and we have given you games, and we have asked nothing of you. Now is the time to tell us. Who are you, and where do you come from, and why does the song of Troy make you weep the way a soldier's widow weeps?" The hall was quiet. Odysseus lowered the cloak from his face. He looked at the king and the queen and the Phaeacian nobles around him in the firelight of a hall at the edge of the world, and he understood that this was the moment the story had been building toward since he had stood at the edge of the olive grove that morning and walked out into the light. He said, "I am Odysseus, son of Laertes, known among men for cunning, and my home is Ithaca." The hall received this in silence. Then he began to tell them everything. The words fell into the hall, the way certain words fall, not loudly, but with a weight that the air seems to hold after they have been spoken. As though the space itself has absorbed something, it will not release easily. Odysseus, son of Laertes of Ithaca. The hall held the name, and the fire held its shape. And the Phaeacian lords along the benches held very still in the particular stillness of people who understand that they are present at something that will be spoken of afterward. Alcinous set down his cup. He did not speak immediately, which was one of the things that made him the king he was. He was a man who understood the value of giving a statement space enough to become fully itself before answering it. He looked at Odysseus for a long moment, and Odysseus let himself be looked at, sitting where he was with the cloak still half raised and his eyes clear now, the weeping done. The kind of clarity that sometimes follows, weeping on his face, the scrubbed and deliberate calm of a man who has decided what he is going to do. Then Alcinous smiled, and the tension in the hall shifted. He said, "We have heard of Odysseus." He said it with the ease of a king who has a bard, who has listened to the bard's accounts of the great men of the age, the way one learns geography from a map. Knowing the features without having stood on the ground, he said, "The name of Odysseus has travelled far enough to reach even us at the edge of things." He called for more wine. The hall returned to motion, servants moving along the benches with heavy jars. Torches being replenished at the wall brackets, the low conversation of lords who have just heard a name they recognize beginning to move around the edges of the room. Arete, sitting at her husband's side in the high seat, looked at Odysseus with the particular attention she had been giving him all evening, the focused and unhurried attention of a woman who has been listening to everything that has been said and is now organizing what it means. It was Arete who spoke next. She noted that the cloak he wore was one she recognized, and she asked how he had come by it. Odysseus answered her directly. He told them of Nausicaa, and how he had come up from the shore and out of the olive grove in the state the sea had left him, and how her daughter had stood where other young women had run, and had given him clothing from the household stores, and directed him towards a city with instructions that he now understood had been as carefully considered as anything else about the morning. He said the instructions had been good ones, and that he had followed them exactly, and that he was grateful for them and for the hospitality of this house. Arete looked at her husband. Something passed between them. The small and legible communication of two people who have been married a long time and have developed a private language made of pauses and angles of attention. Alcinous turned to the nobles around him and said that the question of what the Phaeacians owed this man was not really a question at all. He was a guest. The gods sent guests. The gods also, he noted without particular elaboration, watched how guests were treated. and the Phaeacians had built their entire civilization on the understanding that ships and hospitality were the two things that must not be done poorly. He offered Odysseus passage home. He said it plainly, the way the accounts record most of what Alcinous said, without theatre or extended justification. A ship would be prepared. Rowers would be chosen. The ship would take him to Ithaca and return, because the Phaeacian ships knew their way between places the way a trained horse knows a familiar road, and needed no particular supervision to find what they were sent to find. Odysseus thanked him. The feast continued late into the evening. More food was brought, and the wine was good, and after a time Demodocus put down his lyre, and a space opened in the hall for a different kind of entertainment. Two young men who danced together in the Phaeacian style, a fast and precise thing that required both of them to be exactly where the other expected them to be at each moment, and the nobles watched with the relaxed appreciation of an audience for whom this was familiar and pleasurable rather than exceptional. Odysseus watched with genuine attention. He was a man who watched things. Even now, after everything, he watched the two dancers with the focused observation he brought to most things he encountered, the habit of assessment that had served him more reliably than any other quality he possessed. He watched how they moved and where the skill lived in it, and he thought about skill in general. The way it looks effortless from the outside and requires from the inside an absolute and continuous attention that looks like nothing at all because it has been made invisible through practice. He had been thinking about Ithaca since Ogygia. He had been thinking about Ithaca for longer than that. Somewhere beneath the long years on the island with Calypso, beneath the raft and the storm, and the 2 days in the open water. Beneath the whole sequence of disasters and islands and encounters that the tradition had arranged between Troy and this hall, the thought of Ithaca had persisted, not dramatically. Not as a torch or a beacon or any of the things that the tradition sometimes uses to represent the force of longing. Simply as a fact, quiet and continuous, the way a man knows where his house is, even when he is very far from it. The feast ended when the night had grown full around the palace. Guests and nobles moved to their lodgings, and servants extinguished the outer torches and banked the hearth, and the hall settled into the particular quiet that large rooms settle into when the people have left them, a residual warmth and the smell of good food and the smoke of torches that have been put out recently. Odysseus was shown again to the room with the carved bed and the window over the harbour. He went to the window and stood for a moment looking at the dark water below. The ships were still there at their anchors, the same ships he had heard in the night before, their hulls making small movements against the weight of the water, lines drawing taut and then releasing in the easy motion of vessels that are resting between purposes. One of those ships would take him home. The accounts give the Phaeacian ships a quality that the tradition reserves for very few things. They were described as knowing. Not knowing in the way a trained animal knows its territory, but knowing in a finer sense. The sense in which certain objects made by the gods, or with divine instruction, seem to understand something about the world that ordinary objects did not. The ships knew the harbours and the routes between them. They sailed without pilots at night, and arrived where they were meant to arrive without error. They were, in the tradition's understanding, another example of the quality the whole Phaeacian civilization possessed, the quality of being positioned at the threshold between the ordinary world and something older, so close to the divine ordering of things that the boundary between craft and gift had become indistinct. He lay down on the good bed and listened to the ships below and felt, with a care that was almost physical, the fact that he was one day closer to Ithaca than he had been when he woke beneath the olive leaves. He slept deeply and without disturbance, which the accounts note with the same quiet attention they give to everything in Phaeacia, as though even sleep here was of a better quality than sleep elsewhere, as though the island at the edge of the world offered its guests rest that was genuinely restoring rather than merely the absence of waking. Outside the window, the harbour moved its small and steady movements, and the torches on the palace walls were gone now. and the stars above the harbour were numerous and unhurried in the clear sky that comes over an island after the day's warmth has finally lifted. The morning came gently over the Phaeacian harbour, the way mornings come over sheltered water. Without announcement, simply a gradual brightening of the air above the eastern hills, until the ships at anchor began to show their shapes clearly in the growing light. Odysseus did not sleep past that brightness. He was a man who woke when the light changed. The Phaeacians gave him a fine breakfast and loaded the ship with gifts, bronze and gold and folded cloth, things given freely by a generous people to a guest they had decided to honour, and these were arranged carefully in the hold so they would not shift in the crossing. By the time the sun had fully cleared the hills, the ship was ready and the rowers were at their benches, and Odysseus stood at the stern for a moment, looking back at the palace and at Nausicaa, who had come down to the shore to watch the departure. She stood a little apart from the others. He said something to her before he boarded. The accounts preserve this, though they do not record exactly what was said. Only that she had stood where others would have run, and that he acknowledged it, and that this acknowledgment seemed to satisfy her. The ship moved out of the harbour smoothly, the rowers pulling in a long and practised rhythm, and the white walls of the Phaeacian city grew smaller and then disappeared entirely as the ship rounded the headland and entered open water. What happened next in the crossing the tradition tells plainly. The rowers pulled and the ship ran true, and when the night came, Odysseus fell asleep in the stern, wrapped in the good cloak the Phaeacians had given him. And the ship continued in the darkness without him, running by that peculiar Phaeacian knowledge toward Ithaca. And when it arrived, the men carried him ashore, still sleeping, still wrapped in the cloak, and laid him on the sand beneath an olive tree with all his gifts arranged around him, and returned to their ship and left. He woke on the beach of Ithaca without knowing it was Ithaca. Athena had put a mist over the island, the familiar device of the goddess who guarded him, and the shore looked strange in it, the rocks and the trees unclear, the light diffused. He woke and sat up and looked around and did not recognize the coast, and his first feeling was a familiar one, the feeling of having arrived somewhere other than where he intended. He counted the gifts to make sure they were all there, and they were all there, and he sat on the sand next to them in the morning mist and did not know where he was. A young shepherd appeared on the path above the beach, a shepherd carrying a slender olive wood staff, smooth and pale, its bark stripped long ago and the wood worn further by handling. This shepherd came down toward him with the easy confidence of someone who knew this coast well, and Odysseus watched him come and prepared the version of himself he would offer. Because Odysseus did not give his name easily to strangers in unknown places, the shepherd asked him who he was and how he had come to this shore. Odysseus told a story. He told it fluently and in detail, a story about being a Cretan, about various events that had brought him to this beach, a story that was not true, but that sounded true because he had constructed it carefully in the moment, fitting the pieces together with the attention he brought to all difficult things. The shepherd listened and then smiled, and the mist began to lift. The shepherd was Athena, and she did not seem displeased by the deception. She told him he was home. She told him plainly that he was standing on the soil of Ithaca, and the mist continued to lift as she said it, and the familiar shape of the hills came clear above the beach, and the olive trees, and the quality of the light over the water, which was a light he had been carrying in his memory for 20 years. He did not weep. He touched the ground. Athena told him what he needed to know. She told him about the suitors who had filled his hall for years, eating his stores and drinking his wine and pressing Penelope to choose one of them. She told him about Penelope, still waiting, still holding to the terms she had invented. The shroud she wove for Laertes, and unravelled each night by lamplight, that patient delay brought thread by thread in the darkness of her chamber. She told him that Telemachus had gone to Pylos and to Sparta to seek news of his father. Then she changed him. She touched him, and his body changed the way things change in the tradition when gods act directly on mortal form. His skin darkened and roughened, His hair became sparse and grey, his clothes became the worn rags of a travelling beggar. And the man who had arrived on the shore of Ithaca wrapped in a fine Phaeacian cloak became a man that no one would look at twice, a wandering old man who had nothing worth taking and nothing worth attending to. This was the disguise that would carry him through his own halls. Athena told him to go first to the farm of Eumaeus, the swineherd, who had been loyal across all the years. She told him Telemachus would follow. He gathered his gifts and hid them in the hollow of a cave near the shore, the cave of the nymphs. A long, low space in the limestone rock, where fresh water seeped through the stone and the air inside, smelled of cold mineral darkness and something faintly sweet. He arranged the bronze and gold carefully against the cave wall and covered them with an old sail that had been left there, and went up the path from the beach into the hills of Ithaca. The farm of Eumaeus was set well back from the road, behind a stone wall that the swineherd had built himself. Well made and maintained, the work of a man who had continued caring for things even when the man he cared for them on behalf of had been absent for 20 years, Eumaeus did not recognize him. He saw a ragged old stranger at the gate, and came forward with the hospitality of a man who had learned hospitality young and kept it, offering bread and wine and a place at the fire without asking first who he was or where he came from, because that was the order of things. Food before questions. A guest made comfortable before any account of himself was requested. Odysseus sat at the fire in Eumaeus's farmhouse, and ate and listened to the man talk. Eumaeus talked about the island, about the suitors and the disorder they had brought, about Penelope's endurance and the waste in the hall, about Odysseus himself, spoken of with the plain loyalty of someone who had not abandoned hope only because hope was a thing he kept by habit rather than by reason. He did not know he was talking to Odysseus. The fire in the farmhouse was small and steady, the particular warmth of a place that is not grand but is well kept. And outside in the pens the pigs moved and settled in the sounds animals make when they are fed and enclosed, and the night is coming on gradually around them. Telemachus arrived at the farm the next morning. He came along the path from the harbour road, dusty from the walk, and Eumaeus saw him first and made a sound that was almost involuntary. A low exclamation of relief, because the young man had been gone long enough that worry had become a constant underneath the routine of the farm. Eumaeus embraced him at the gate. The old swineherd embraced him with the unguarded affection of someone who had watched over him since childhood, the way a man holds what he has been keeping safe. Odysseus watched this from the doorway. He watched his son come through the gate. Telemachus was broad-shouldered now, carrying himself with the careful uprightness of a young man who had learned that others would read meaning into how he stood. He was not a boy. He had been a boy when Odysseus left for Troy. What stood in the gateway of Eumaeus's farm was something different. A man who had grown up in the absence of his father, in a hall full of men who treated his inheritance as their own entertainment. Eumaeus went inside to prepare food, because that was the order of things. Odysseus and Telemachus sat alone in the farmhouse. Then Athena came. She did not enter the farmhouse. She appeared at the threshold in the form she chose, visible only to Odysseus, and she indicated with a slight gesture that the moment had arrived. Odysseus stepped outside. Athena touched him again. The change reversed itself. The roughened skin softened, the grey and sparse hair darkened. His bearing altered, the stoop of the beggar replaced by the straightness of a man who had commanded ships, who had spoken in councils of kings. For a moment on the hillside of Ithaca he stood as himself. Then Athena withdrew, and he went back in. Telemachus looked up. He looked up at the figure that had walked back through the farmhouse door, and he did not understand what he was seeing. The ragged old stranger had become someone else. He said what gods, and he said it quietly, because in the tradition of such moments the first response is not recognition but awe. Odysseus told him he was not a god. He told him plainly that he was his father. He said it simply, with the directness of someone who had spent long enough arriving at this moment that he had no patience left for a slow approach. Telemachus did not move at first. Then he wept. He was a young man who had kept himself together through considerable difficulty, who had sailed alone to foreign kings and held his composure in the halls of Nestor and Menelaus, who had returned to an island full of men who mocked him and done it without breaking. He wept now. They wept together in Eumaeus's farmhouse, the two of them, the sound of it swallowed by the thick walls and the noise of the animals outside. And then they were done, and they sat, and they began to speak about what needed to be done. The tale tells that this conversation was practical. Odysseus had not come home to weep. He asked about the suitors. How many, how armed, who among the household staff remained loyal? Telemachus counted for him. More than 100 men filled the hall most days. Among the servants, most would obey whoever held power, because that was what most people did. But Eumaeus the swineherd was loyal, and Philoetius the cowherd was loyal. Odysseus listened. He nodded slowly. He told Telemachus that when he came into the hall he would come again as the beggar. He told Telemachus to take the weapons from the walls, to move the spears and swords and helmets that hung there into the storeroom, leaving only enough to account for the removal plausibly. He told him what to say if the suitors asked, that he was keeping them from the damp of the hall, from the smoke that would dull the bronze. He told him to leave out 2 swords, 2 spears, 2 shields, because when the time came, they would need to reach them quickly. Telemachus listened to all of this with the focused attention of someone who had been waiting a long time to be given something useful to do. Then Eumaeus returned, and the conversation ended, and Odysseus was the old beggar again. In the days that followed, the telling passes over many small movements and settles on what remained. The tradition notes that an old dog lay in the dung heap near the palace door. He was called Argos, and he had been Odysseus's dog, bred and trained by him before the fleet assembled for Troy and then left behind. And now very old, with the clouded eyes and the stillness of an animal near the end of its life. When Odysseus passed through the gate in his beggar's rags, Argos lifted his head. The dog recognized him. 20 years, and the smell of him came through the disguise. Argos lifted his ears and dropped his tail and looked at him. He did not have the strength to rise. Odysseus saw him and looked away quickly, because to stop was to risk everything, and the tale notes that he passed through the gate, and Argos put his head back down, and the dog died there. In the dung heap, having done the one last thing he was waiting to do, inside the hall, the suitors did not look at the old beggar twice. That was how the disguise worked. He moved through the hall, and they saw what he appeared to be, an old man with nothing, asking for scraps. Some tossed him bread, some insulted him. One threw a footstool. He bore it all with the patience of a man who had endured far worse, who had sat in the cave of a Cyclops and waited for the right moment, who had stood tied to a mast listening to music that tried to undo him, who had swum 2 days in open water and arrived on a foreign shore and still found a way to be received as a guest. The patience was not absence of feeling. It was discipline so long practiced that it had become indistinguishable from stillness. Penelope had him brought before her. She sat in her chair in the upper hall and looked at this old beggar and asked him who he was and where he had come from, and whether he had heard anything in his wanderings of Odysseus. The tale says she looked at him with the careful attention of a woman who had spent 20 years reading the faces of strangers for useful information. She was practiced at it. Odysseus did not tell her who he was. He told her instead a story of Crete, a story he had told in some form to many people, and he worked into it a detail that he had once hosted Odysseus himself, that he had seen him pass through Crete on his way to Troy, that the man had been remarkable, and that based on what he had heard in his wanderings, Odysseus would be home before the year was out. Penelope listened to all of this with an expression the tale describes as one that had learned how to hold hope and grief in equal measure without letting either show fully. She had heard promising things from strangers before. She had learned that hope offered by strangers was not the same as hope she could rest her weight on. She ordered that the old beggar be given a bath, that his feet be washed. The nurse Euryclea was sent to wash him. Euryclea was old. She had been old when Odysseus was young, and she had nursed him as an infant, and the tale notes that she retained the sharpness that careful people keep. She brought the basin and knelt before him. Her hands found the scar above the knee. The boar had made that scar on a hunt on Mount Parnassus when Odysseus was a young man. A hunt with his grandfather Autolycus's sons. It was a particular scar, old and white, and shaped by the tusk in a specific way that was not like other scars. Her fingers recognized it before her mind had finished asking the question. She looked up. Her eyes found his. Odysseus's hand moved to her chin. He pressed gently, a firm and quiet pressure, and turned her face aside and spoke in a voice barely above a breath. He told her to say nothing. He told her that her silence was essential, that if she loved him, she would keep this. Euryclea looked at him, and her eyes filled, and she pressed her lips together, and she held it. She held everything he had asked her to hold. She finished washing his feet. She dried them. She set the basin aside. Outside, Penelope sat by the fire and did not know what the nurse had found in the lamplight near the floor. The night passed slowly over the palace of Ithaca, and the fire in the great hall burned lower as the suitors eventually made their way to their beds in the houses of the town. Moving through the dark streets in loose groups, talking loudly in the way of men who had drunk well and had nothing pressing waiting for them in the morning, the hall emptied. The servants moved through it quietly, gathering cups and pushing the long benches back against the walls. The smell of the feast hung in the air, wine and smoke and the fat of roasted meat. And the lamps were put out one by one until only a few remained burning in their brackets, casting small circles of amber light against the darkness. Odysseus lay down near the doorway in a pile of sheepskins that had been left out for him. He did not sleep. He lay on his back in the darkness and listened to the palace settle around him, the creak of old timbers, the sound of the sea coming in through the open windows of the upper rooms, the distant bark of a dog somewhere on the hillside above the town. He lay and looked at the ceiling of his own hall and thought about the morning. Penelope could not sleep either. The tale holds her memory sitting in the chair by the dead fire long after the servants had gone to their rooms, the spindle in her hands quiet. Her eyes on the window where the sky was beginning to show the first suggestion of something lighter at its eastern edge. She sat with the weight of what the strange old beggar had said to her. He would be home before the year was out. She had heard such things before. She knew how to hold them without breaking either toward belief or away from it. And yet the beggar had known details about Odysseus. The colour of his cloak, the brooch it was pinned with. She sat with those details, the way one sits with a small flame in wind, carefully, not breathing too hard in any direction. In the morning she made her decision. She came down into the great hall while it was still early, before most of the suitors had arrived to fill the benches with their noise and their expectations. She walked to the inner chamber herself, the locked room behind the storeroom, where the weapons had been stored before Telemachus had moved the swords and spears down from the walls 2 nights previous. As Odysseus had instructed him, there was another thing in that locked room. It had been there for a long time, kept in a leather case that had darkened with age, and was soft now in the way that old leather becomes soft, supple, and quiet to the touch. It had been placed there with intention, after the departure for Troy, put away in the way that one puts away something too important to risk and too beloved to sell. Inside the case was a bow. The bow had been a gift. The man who gave it was named Iphitus, son of Eurytus of Oechalia, a man who had possessed his own great bow and was the finest archer of his generation. He and Odysseus had met in Messene years before the ships gathered for Troy, when they were both young men, and the friendship between them had been immediate and genuine. They had recognized in each other a quality that had no clear name, but that both men understood. They had exchanged gifts, as was proper between men who wished to mark a friendship as real. Iphitus had given Odysseus the bow. Odysseus had given Iphitus a sword and a spear. It was Iphitus's father's bow, and it was a remarkable thing, the work of a craftsman who had understood the deep relationship between wood and sinew, and the particular give of a good laminated stave. Iphitus had died not long after. He was killed by Heracles, who had taken the man's horses and then killed him when he came to ask for them back. It was one of those deaths that the ancient accounts note without dwelling on, because the world was full of such things, remarkable men cut short, and the bow remained as the only evidence that Iphitus had been. Odysseus had never taken it to Troy. He had kept it home out of respect for the memory of the man who had given it. Penelope carried it out of the storeroom herself. She carried it into the hall with the case in her arms and the key in her hand, and the suitors were arriving now through the main doors. Taking their places along the benches, calling for wine and bread in their ordinary morning voices, they looked up when she appeared on the threshold of the hall. A woman carrying something they had not seen before. Their attention followed her to the center of the room. She told them what it was. She said it in a voice that carried through the hall with the particular clarity of someone who has prepared what they will say and is not uncertain about the words. She said that the time had come, that she had waited long enough, and that there had been no word, no certain word, from Odysseus, and that she had made an accounting with herself, a private reckoning, and had arrived at a decision. She said that she would marry the man who could string this bow and shoot an arrow through the rings of 12 axes set in a line. The suitors were very quiet for a moment. Then the noise began. It was the noise of men who have been in competition for something they want very much, and have just been told the competition has been formally declared. Some of them were excited. Some of them had the more careful look of men who were calculating odds. They all understood that a bow left unstrung for many years was a bow with a stave that had lost nothing of its old resistance and would be difficult to bend. The axes were arranged. That was the labour of the morning. A long trench was dug in the floor of the hall by the servants, a shallow channel running the length of the room, and into this trench were set 12 axes in a line, each with its double loop of iron at the base of the blade, each loop aligned with the next, so that an arrow shot with sufficient force and precision would pass through all 12 rings in sequence. It was the kind of archery that required not only the strength to draw the bow, but the steadiness that came from something beyond strength. The suitors drew lots for the order. There is a quality to the waiting that the ancient telling preserves carefully. The hall grew warm as the morning advanced, and the light came in through the high windows and fell in long slanted bars across the packed earth floor. The smell of the freshly turned trench was in the air, a clean, dark smell of earth. The bow passed from hand to hand among the men, and each man who received it looked at it with the particular expression of someone who does not want to reveal that they understand something will be difficult. The first man tried. He was one of the younger suitors. Broad in the chest, confident in the way of men who have always found physical tasks easy, he took the bow and planted his feet and pulled at the string with his whole body. The stave bent a little, not enough. He tried again, changing his grip. His face went red with the effort. He could not string it. He handed it to the next man. The next man tried also. He had rapped the lower tip of the bow against the floor to try to use the leverage of the earth itself to help him bend the stave enough to loop the string. It did not help. The bow moved along the benches, and the morning moved with it, and the suitors' voices changed gradually as the time passed. They grew quieter. There were jokes, but they were the jokes of men who are hiding their concern, and the jokes were not very good. And nobody laughed at them very hard. Antinous, who was the most powerful of the suitors and understood himself to be the most likely eventual winner, called for a break. He said they should heat the bow, that the wood needed to be warmed with fat to restore its old suppleness. It was a reasonable idea. The servants brought fat from the kitchen, rendered and warm, and the bough was rubbed with it carefully and then held near the fire so that the heat could work into the stave. During this interval, Odysseus made his way through the confusion to the doorway at the side of the hall. He had been watching from his place near the wall, still in his beggar's rags, still wearing the particular stillness of a man who had learnt to wait. Two men had also moved toward the door. Eumaeus the swineherd and Philoetius the cowherd. He brought them outside. They stood together in the side court of the palace, away from the sound of the hall, in the smell of animals and fresh morning air. He looked at them, two men who had served the house of Odysseus faithfully through 20 years of uncertainty. Two men who had gone on feeding the herds and maintaining the farms when there was no king to answer to and no certain prospect of one returning. They had done it out of something that was not hope exactly, or not hope alone, but a fidelity too old and too established to be easily redirected. He showed them the scar. He pulled the rags aside from his thigh and showed them the mark above the knee. White against the old olive of his skin, shaped by the tusk of a boar on the slope of Parnassus. In a year they would both have been too young to remember, but would have heard spoken of, because it was the kind of story that got told in farmhouses on long winter evenings. The mark of Autolycus's hunt, the mark that Euryclea had found with her fingers in the lamplight. Eumaeus looked at it. He looked up. His eyes were very steady. The eyes of a man who had dealt with difficult information his whole life by giving himself a moment to receive it fully before deciding anything. He received it. Then his face changed. Not dramatically, not with the noise that men make in certain stories when they learn astonishing things. Quietly, his eyes filled and his lips pressed together, and he reached out and took the wrist of the man before him. He held it. Philoetius made a sound, something very low and involuntary. He pressed his hand over his mouth. He looked at the old beggar who was not an old beggar, and his whole body held the information with difficulty, as though the ordinary structures of his chest were not quite large enough to contain what had just been placed there. Odysseus told them plainly what was going to happen. He told them that when the bough came to him, he would take it and try it. He told them not to react when he strung it. He told Philoetius that when the moment came he was to go to the great doors of the hall and pull them closed and fasten them. He told Eumaeus that when he gave a signal he was to bring the bough to him directly, not to the suitors, not through any intermediate hand. He looked at them both. He said that if the gods were with them, they would all see this resolved before the day was out. And if not, he said it without finishing the thought, because there was no version of, not that any of them wished to hold in mind just then. They went back inside separately. The bough was still being warmed at the fire. The suitors were talking among themselves, filling cups, trying to restore the feeling of an ordinary feast day morning. Some of them looked at the axes in the floor. Some of them looked at the bough. Some of them looked at the door where Penelope had gone back to her upper room after setting everything in motion. After setting down the bow that had belonged to a man she had loved and had been waiting for and could not know, was sitting in her hall wearing the rags of a stranger. The bow was given back from the fire when Antinous judged the waiting long enough. It passed again along the bench. 2 more men tried. Neither succeeded. One of them was younger than the others, with broad shoulders and the confidence of someone who had not yet failed publicly at anything that mattered. He held the bow a long time before setting it down. When he set it down, he did not look at the man beside him. Then Odysseus stood up from his place near the wall. He did not make a speech. He simply stood and asked, in the voice of an old man with nothing particular at stake, whether the beggar might be allowed to try the bow. He said he wished to know whether his hands still held something of the strength they had once had, long ago, in another life. The hall turned toward him. Some of the suitors laughed. One said that the wine had reached the old man's head. Another said that beggars who tried kings' bows in kings' halls were likely to find themselves with more trouble than they had arrived with. Antinous said it flatly and without humour. The beggar would not touch the bow. He said it as a man says a thing that requires no further discussion. But Telemachus spoke. He had been sitting at the table nearest the door, quiet through the morning's failures, watching his father from across the hall with the steadiness of a young man who has learned to hold things very still inside himself. He said, without raising his voice, that the bow had been put forward for any man to try, and that the beggar was a man, and that the contest was not Antinous' to restrict. There was a silence. Antinous looked at Telemachus across the length of the hall. It was the look of a man calculating what this moment meant, and what it would cost to press the argument, and what it would cost not to. He said nothing more. One of the serving women started toward Odysseus with the bow, then hesitated, because Eumaeus was already moving. He crossed the floor directly. He carried the bow in both hands, held a little away from his body, and set it before the man in rags without looking at the suitors on either side of him. Odysseus took it. He turned it in his hands. He looked at it carefully, the way a man looks at something he knows very well after a long absence, checking for changes, finding none that matter. He ran his thumb along the stave. He examined one of the tips, tilting it toward the light from the high windows where the morning came in pale and slanted across the packed earth floor. The hall was quiet now. Whatever noise had filled it before, the complaints and the jokes and the cups set down on wood, had drained away. The suitors watched. They did not quite know what they were watching, but something in the quality of the old man's handling had changed the feeling in the room. Odysseus set the lower tip against the floor. He did not strain. He did not redden or set his jaw or press his eyes shut. He simply bent the stave with the practiced ease of someone returning to a motion his body still remembered, and looped the string over the tip and stood the bow upright. It was strung. There was a sound then from the benches. Not words. Something below words, collective and involuntary. The sound men make when a thing happens that they had arranged their understanding of the world to prevent from happening. Odysseus plucked the string once. It sang, clear and single and very steady, the note a bowstring makes when it has been properly set. The sound went up into the rafters and settled there, and the hall held it a moment. He reached for an arrow. There was one lying on the table beside him, set apart from the contest, and he took it and knocked it without ceremony. He looked down the length of the hall. The 12 axes stood in their shallow trench, their iron loops aligned. The morning light caught the metal here and there, small cold points of brightness running the length of the floor. He drew, released. The arrow moved through the hall with a sound like tearing silk, clean and level, and passed through the first loop, and then the second, and all the rest in sequence, and struck the wall at the far end of the hall with a sound of finality. The tale has been told so many times that it is difficult now to hold the silence that followed. But the silence was real. It lasted long enough to contain everything that the hall had been waiting to resolve for 3 years, or 20, depending on how one counts. Telemachus rose from his place. He had been waiting for this too. He reached beneath the table and took up the sword and spear that had been set there 2 nights before, on his father's instruction, on the night the weapons came down from the walls. He buckled the sword at his hip. He took a position by his father and stood there armed in the morning light, without saying anything. Philoetius had already gone to the great doors. He was a quiet man, deliberate in his movements. He pulled the doors closed as though he were simply doing the ordinary work of a cowherd closing a gate against the evening. He dropped the bar. The sound it made was low and solid, wood against wood, and it did not echo. It simply ended. The suitors understood now. Antinous had risen. He was reaching for his cup, or appearing to reach for his cup, which was near enough to the place where weapons might have been kept before they were moved. He looked at the beggar, who was not a beggar. He looked at Telemachus. He began to say something. Odysseus told them who he was. He did not say it loudly. The hall was so quiet by then that there was no need for volume. He told them that the contest was over, that a different kind of reckoning had arrived, and that the dogs who had eaten his food and lain with his servants and presumed to take the place of a man who was not dead would now discover what that man was capable of, having returned. He turned the bow toward Antinous. The first arrow flew. The tale does not linger long on what followed. The accounts that have carried this story through the centuries note the fact of it, the sequence of it, the role that Athena played. Moving through the hall in the form of a swallow, settling in the high rafters and watching, and at certain moments tilting the outcome as a scale is tilted by the addition of something very small but precisely placed. Eumaeus fought, Philoetius fought. Telemachus took up his full armour from the store Odysseus had directed him to, and stood beside his father. And the suitors who had come to Ithaca from across the islands and imagined themselves the probable inheritors of a kingdom found instead what it meant to have miscalculated the patience of a man who had survived the sea. When it was finished, the hall was very still. The morning light came in through the high windows and lay across the floor. Telemachus stood with his father in the quiet. Eumaeus and Philoetius were unhurt. The 12 axes stood yet in their trench, untouched by everything that had happened around them, iron and patient in the turned earth. Athena was no longer visible in the rafters. She had withdrawn, the way divine attention withdraws when a mortal's work is complete, leaving behind only the ordinary light of an ordinary morning in a hall that smelled of smoke and iron, and the fresh earth of the trench, and the faint persistent sweetness of the fat still worked into the grain of the great bow. Odysseus stood in the centre of his own hall, in the rags of a beggar, holding the bow of Iphitus. He did not move for a while. The story says he stood there in the quiet of what had been accomplished, and looked at the length of the hall, at the axes in their row, at the arrow lodged in the far wall at the end of its long flight through 12 loops of iron. He had been 20 years away. He was home. The story does not explain how long he stood there. Certain accounts suggest Telemachus spoke first, and that his father answered him briefly, and then directed him to take Eumaeus and Philoetius and see to the practical matters that follow a reckoning. Other accounts suggest the opposite order, that Odysseus moved first, setting the bow of Iphitus down on the long table with deliberate care, and that Telemachus simply watched him and understood without being told what came next. What all versions agree upon is that at some point the hall was cleared. Eumaeus and Philoetius were trusted with this, and they carried out the work without ceremony, as men do who have spent their lives managing difficult and unglamorous things. The doors were unbarred. The morning came fully in. The windows admitted a light that had grown less slanted and more direct, and the hall, that had been a place of contest and then of reckoning, became simply a hall again. Smelling of earth and iron, and the morning air coming off the hills of Ithaca, the 12 axes were left in their trench. No account explains exactly when they were removed or who removed them. The trench and the axes had served their purpose, and that purpose was complete, and the story moves on from the hall without pausing to note the moment of their removal. They pass from the tale as quietly as they entered it, iron and patient, set down and then eventually taken up again, as all things are. Odysseus sent Telemachus to find Penelope. The tale is careful here. Telemachus went to his mother's chamber and stood at the door and spoke to her, and what he said was not simple. He told her that the beggar who had spent the night in the hall was a man she ought to come and see. He did not tell her more than that, because he had been asked not to, and because some recognitions cannot be prepared for. They must arrive on their own terms. Penelope came down. She came into the hall, and she saw the man standing at the far end of it, still wearing the clothes of a beggar. The bow of Iphitus no longer in his hands. She stood some distance from him and looked at him. The morning light was full and clear, and there was nothing in the hall to obstruct her view. She did not run to him. The tale preserves this with great care. Penelope of Ithaca, who had held a household together for 20 years through patience and calculation and a weaver's particular discipline, did not collapse at the sight of this man. She stood in the doorway of her own hall, and she looked at him, and she did not know yet whether to believe what she was seeing. The nurse Euryclea, who knew the scar and had kept the secret, urged her to go forward. She said something impatient, in the way that women who have managed things for a long time sometimes speak to people they love who are being too careful. Penelope heard her. She did not move. She said, "If this is truly my husband, then he will know what I know, and I will know him by that." She turned to the servants, and she said, "Take the great bed, the marriage bed, and move it from the chamber into this hall, so that he may sleep here tonight." Odysseus heard this. The story records that he became, suddenly, briefly, entirely himself. Whatever stillness the morning had settled over him broke open for a moment. He said, "Who has moved that bed?" He said, "That bed cannot be moved." He said, "I built that bed myself, and I built it around the trunk of a living olive tree, a tree that grew from the ground of this island, that I shaped with my own hands into the post of a marriage bed, and the room around it was built afterward. And the frame of it is rooted in the earth of Ithaca, and no man alive can move it without first destroying it, and if the bed has been moved, then someone has done that, and I would know, and that is something I did not know until this moment, which means either the bed is where I built it, or everything I believe is wrong." He stopped speaking. The hall was quiet. Penelope came to him then. She came across the floor of the hall, and she put her arms around him, and she wept. The tale says she wept for a long time. It says that the feeling was like a man coming up from the sea after a long time under water, the way the air arrives, and the light, and the solid ground beneath the feet. And the body does not quite believe it yet, but begins, slowly, to understand. She told him she had not moved the bed. She told him she had needed to know. She said, "I have kept so many men away from this house, and I could not afford to be wrong once, and forgive me. And I am not wrong." They sat together in the hall for a time, and then they went to the chamber, to the room built around the living olive tree that still grew in the packed earth of the island, its heartwood smoothed into the post of a bed that had not moved in 20 years. Athena noticed this. The tales that touch on what happened next are careful to say it plainly. Athena held back the dawn. She stilled the horses of Eos at the eastern edge of the world, and she kept the night extended, not by any great or noisy act, but by a quiet delay. A small adjustment of the heavenly order, so that the night above Ithaca was longer than other nights. The stars stayed in their places longer. The sky remained dark over the island. The sea surrounding it lay still and very dark, and the hills of Ithaca were silent. The olive tree was old. It had been growing in that ground long before the room was built around it. It had grown through Odysseus's boyhood, through his wedding, through the 20 years of his absence, through the suitors and their noise and the seasons passing over the island. Its roots went down into the rock. Its trunk was a post in a marriage bed. The room had been built around it. Penelope lay beside her husband in the bed that could not be moved. She told him what she had endured. He told her what he had endured. The tale says they took turns, that the night was long enough for both of them, that Athena gave them the hours and they used them. He told her of the sea, of the years with Calypso, of the raft and the storm, of the Phaeacian shore, of all the long years of water between him and this room. She told him of the shroud, of the nights at the loom undoing what the days had made, of the suitors and their weight in the house, of Telemachus and how he had grown. The night held over them, generous and dark. When the morning finally came, it came gently. The light moved across the hills of Ithaca in the way that early light does, arriving quietly, not demanding anything. The sea below the palace cliffs received it without making any great response. The island lay in the ordinary beauty of an autumn morning, unremarkable to any eye that did not know what had happened in the night. Ithaca was at rest. The tale has carried this far through more centuries than can be easily counted. Different hands have held it, different voices have given it different shapes, different ages have found different things inside it, but the bed remains in every version. Rooted, fixed, built around a living thing that could not be moved without being destroyed. This is what Penelope needed to know. This is what proved it. If you made it to the end, thank you. Take a moment to like and subscribe if these stories have become part of your nights, and let me know in the comments that you stayed. It always means something to know who was here.